Hello everyone and welcome back to the Horror Hut. Now, I know a lot of you use these videos to sleep, so before you drift off I thought it would be a fun idea if everyone can leave a comment to let me know where you are listening from in the world. Also like and subscribe if you are enjoying the episodes. Right, let's get comfy and relax and let's begin. I checked into a roadside motel late that night, just me and my car loaded with luggage. I'd been on the road for hours, tired, my neck stiff from leaning over the steering wheel. This wasn't my first choice, but the highway had stretched on without any other places for miles, and I couldn't push through any longer. The motel was small and quiet. It looked clean enough, if a little rundown, the sign flickering above as the night manager handed me a key. He was quiet, didn't say much, and just glanced up at me once before looking back down. My room was a short walk from the lobby, facing an empty parking lot with a single street lamp. I double-checked the lock, set my bag down, and finally let myself relax. The room was simple: a bed, a dresser, an old TV bolted to the wall. My head pounded, and I needed a shower before I crashed for the night. I turned on the bathroom light, the fluorescent bulb buzzing overhead, and let the water run to warm up. That's when I noticed it, a tiny hole in the wall by the sink, about chest height, facing the shower. I leaned in closer. The hole was small, barely the width of a pen, but cleanly drilled. I covered it with my finger, feeling the rough edges. Then I let go, stepping back. Maybe it was nothing. Maybe someone had just drilled through the wall by mistake, maybe it was from some other repair, but something about it just made me feel unsettled. I pulled out a wad of tissue and stuffed it into the hole, trying to ignore the feeling that something was off. I showered quickly, trying to shake off the uneasy feeling. But even after I was dressed and out of the bathroom, my skin still felt prickly, like I was being watched. I tried to push it from my mind, turned on the TV to drown out the silence, and sat on the bed, staring blankly at the screen. I was halfway through some rerun when I heard a soft knock on the wall. It wasn't loud, more like a tapping. My first thought was that it was probably just some sound from the plumbing, but something told me to look. I went back into the bathroom and saw it right away. The tissue I had stuffed in the hole was gone. I just stood there for a second, staring. Someone on the other side had pulled it out. I felt my heart start to pound. I grabbed more tissue, wadding it up tightly, and shoved it into the hole again. I pressed hard, making sure it was in there good. Then I stepped back, trying to breathe, trying to tell myself it didn't mean anything. I left the bathroom and sat on the edge of the bed, listening. I didn't know what I was waiting for, but my ears were straining for any sound. The TV buzzed in the background, but I couldn't focus on it. Then, maybe a few minutes later, I heard the tapping again. I felt a wave of dread wash over me. I didn't want to check, but I couldn't stop myself. I got up, walked back into the bathroom, and looked. The tissue was gone again. My hands were shaking. I leaned in, putting my eye close to the hole, trying to see through it, but it was pitch dark on the other side. Whoever was there, they were waiting, watching, silent. I backed away slowly, feeling panic starting to creep up on me. I went to the door, opened it a crack, and looked out into the parking lot. It was empty, just the lone street lamp casting a yellow glow. I thought about going to the front desk, but the night manager's face flashed in my mind, that quick, indifferent glance he'd given me. I wasn't sure I trusted him, wasn't sure what he'd say or if he'd even believe me. I went back inside and locked the door, then grabbed a towel and shoved it into the hole as tightly as I could. I was almost laughing at myself for being so scared over something that could easily be nothing. But even as I sat down, I kept glancing at the bathroom door. I didn't sleep well that night. Every sound seemed louder in the quiet. I was drifting in and out of sleep, the TV light flickering in the corner of my vision, when I heard it again, this time, it was different. Not a knock, but more like scratching, like someone was dragging something against the wall. I sat up, my heart racing. I didn't want to check, didn't want to go back in there, but I knew I couldn't just sit there all night. I forced myself to get up, took a deep breath, and opened the bathroom door. The towel was gone. The hole was empty again, just a dark void in the wall. I couldn't breathe. I backed out, nearly tripping over my own feet, and shut the bathroom door, locking it. I stood there in the middle of the room, clutching my arms, feeling trapped. Whoever it was, they were just on the other side of that wall. They knew I was there, they knew I'd seen the hole, and they didn't care. I felt completely exposed, like they were just waiting for me to make a move, waiting to see what I'd do next. I spent the rest of the night sitting against the headboard, staring at the bathroom door. I didn't know if they'd come through it, didn't know if they'd try to break in. I felt like prey, like something was circling just out of sight, waiting. As soon as the first light of dawn came through the window, I grabbed my bag, left the room, and didn't look back. I didn't bother checking out, didn't bother saying anything to the manager. I got in my car and drove, my hands shaking on the wheel, my heart pounding like I'd just escaped something I couldn't even understand. I don't think I'll ever be able to stay in a roadside motel again. I'll never forget that feeling, the sense of being watched, of being hunted, and knowing that someone, somewhere, had been watching me the whole time. The house seemed fine when I first moved in. A little old, maybe. Some creaky floors, that weird smell you get with old buildings, but nothing too bad. I found it cheap online and signed the lease without thinking much. I just wanted somewhere to be alone, somewhere I could work and save some cash. First few days, everything was all right. But then I found the first note. It was small, handwritten on a torn piece of lined paper, hidden just under the bathroom sink. It had been tucked behind one of the pipes, almost like it wasn't meant to be found. The handwriting was messy, like someone had written it in a hurry. It just said, "Be careful. He knows." I wasn't sure what to think. He knows? Who was he? I figured it was just some leftover junk from a previous tenant, maybe a kid pulling a prank or something. I didn't think much of it and tossed it out. The next one showed up 2 days later. I'd been cleaning out one of the cupboards in the kitchen, trying to make space for my stuff. There, stuck to the inside of the cupboard door with a piece of dried up tape, was another note. This one was shorter. He watches. This was when I started getting nervous. The note looked old, like it had been there for a while, but something about it felt too personal. Like it was meant for me to see. I tried to brush it off, but it didn't feel like a prank anymore. I tossed this one out, too, but it nagged at me, hanging in the back of my mind. The third note came a week later, under the bed frame. I was vacuuming and found it taped to the bottom of the slats. It was the same messy handwriting, and it just said, "Whatever you do, don't look for him." By now, I was getting freaked out. These notes weren't just left lying around, they were hidden. Someone had taken time to place them in spots they knew would eventually be found. I felt like someone was watching me, like every step I took in that house was known to someone else. I tried to calm myself down, telling myself it was just some random trash from whoever lived here before me. I even tried calling the landlord, but he just laughed it off, told me people had been moving in and out of that place for years. Probably just some leftover things from the last guy, he said, chuckling like it was nothing. I tried to let it go, but the notes didn't stop. A few nights later, I was lying in bed when I felt something hard under my pillow. My heart pounded as I pulled it out, another piece of torn paper. It read, "He waits until you're asleep." That was it. I couldn't shake the feeling that someone was coming into the house, maybe even sneaking in while I was out or asleep. I started keeping the lights on, checking every window, every door. I went around with a flashlight, opening every cupboard, every closet, every crawl space, just to make sure I was alone. But nothing. There was no one there, nothing strange that I could find. Still, every night, I'd lie there, waiting for a noise, half expecting to see someone standing in the dark corner of my room. Then came the worst note. I'd come home late from work. It was a long day, I was exhausted, and all I wanted was to collapse on my bed. But when I walked in, there was a piece of paper sitting on the middle of my bed, right on top of the covers. It didn't look like the other notes, though. It was fresh, crisp, as if it had just been placed there. The handwriting was different, neater. The words were larger, bolder. It read, "I know what you did." I don't know why, but seeing that made my stomach drop. The other notes had been creepy, sure, but this one, it felt personal, like it was directed at me specifically. I stood there in my room, feeling a chill run down my spine. I'd never done anything, hadn't hurt anyone, hadn't wronged anyone. I couldn't shake the feeling that someone was trying to get into my head, trying to mess with me. I wanted to leave, pack my things and never come back. But part of me was too stubborn, too unwilling to let whoever was behind this scare me out of my own place. I told myself it was just some sick prank, probably the landlord trying to mess with me or something. I even set up a camera in my bedroom to see if I could catch anyone sneaking in. But nothing happened for a few days, and I started to feel a bit calmer. The camera footage was always empty. Maybe whoever it was had finally stopped. I was almost starting to relax again, starting to think I could sleep without constantly looking over my shoulder. Then, 2 nights later, I found a note inside my pillowcase. I hadn't noticed it until I put my hand in and felt the paper. My hands were shaking as I pulled it out, and there, in that same neat handwriting, was a single line, "We saw you." I didn't sleep that night. I lay awake, every sound amplified in the silence, the faint creak of the floorboards, the tick of the old clock in the hallway. Every now and then, I'd get up, check the locks, double-check the windows, but nothing seemed out of place. Finally, when the sun started to rise, I decided I couldn't take it anymore. I packed my things in a hurry, tossing clothes and whatever I could fit into my bag. As I reached under the bed to grab my shoes, I felt something crumpled and hard under my hand. Another note. I didn't even want to look at it. My stomach was twisted up, my heart pounding so hard I thought it would burst. But I couldn't leave without seeing what it said. The note was short. Just 3 words. "We'll be back." I didn't waste another second. I grabbed my bag, left my keys on the table, and bolted out of the house. I didn't even bother looking back. I drove straight out of town, didn't stop until I was hours away. To this day, I have no idea who left those notes, who he was, or what they meant by "we'll be back." I don't know if someone was watching me the whole time, if they'd been there in the house, just waiting for me to find the notes. I've tried to forget, to push it all out of my mind, but sometimes, when I'm alone, I'll remember that last note and wonder, are they still watching? The first time I saw him, I didn't think much of it. We were both stuck in this tiny, cramped airport terminal waiting for a delayed flight. It was late, past midnight, and most of the people around looked exhausted. I was tired, too, but I was still awake enough to notice things around me. He caught my eye, mostly because he was the only other person awake, pacing around like he had somewhere urgent to be. He eventually sat down across from me. He smiled, and I smiled back out of politeness. He seemed normal at first. He had a tired face, maybe mid-40s, and wore this old, worn-out jacket like he'd been traveling a long time. I could relate, so when he asked if he could sit closer, I shrugged and said sure. We both had hours to kill anyway, so a little chat seemed harmless. He introduced himself as Mike and asked where I was headed. I told him I was flying back home, and he nodded, saying he was flying to the same city. He kept the conversation going, asking about my job, my family. I was a bit surprised by how many questions he asked, but I figured maybe he was just a talkative guy. He was friendly enough, so I answered, trying not to give away too much. After a while, he started talking about his life. He'd been a truck driver, always on the road, always moving. He had a few kids but said they didn't keep in touch. He sounded lonely, and I felt a bit bad for him. We talked on and off for the next hour or so, and though he seemed a bit intense, he didn't say or do anything that really bothered me. Not at first. But after a while, something changed. He stopped smiling as much and started asking different kinds of questions. Personal questions, things about my routine, my schedule, whether I lived alone. It made me uncomfortable, and I tried to steer the conversation somewhere else. But he kept circling back to me, almost like he was studying me. His eyes never left my face. I tried to give shorter answers, hoping he'd get the hint. When the announcement finally came over the speakers that our flight was ready for boarding, I felt a huge wave of relief. I stood up, saying something about needing to grab my things, and turned to leave, hoping he'd stay behind. But he stood up right after me, following close, too close. I figured maybe he was just eager to get on the plane, but he kept standing there, just watching me. I told him, in the nicest way I could manage, that I'd see him on the flight, and tried to make my way toward the boarding line alone. But he didn't leave. He followed me into the line, standing right behind me, not saying a word. I looked around, hoping someone else would notice how close he was standing, how uncomfortable I looked, but everyone was busy, too tired or too distracted to notice. When I finally got to the front and handed my boarding pass to the attendant, he was still there, right next to me. The attendant glanced at him and asked to see his boarding pass, too. But he didn't pull one out. Instead, he turned to the attendant, his face dead serious, and said, "I'm with her. We're together." I felt my stomach drop. I stammered something, tried to tell the attendant that no, we weren't together. I didn't even know him. But he kept insisting, saying we were a couple, that we'd been sitting together the whole time. I could see the attendant's face shift, going from confusion to suspicion, and I felt myself start to panic. I tried to explain, but he kept interrupting, getting louder and more insistent. Finally, I looked right at him and told him to leave me alone, that I didn't know him. The attendant looked between us, clearly unsure what to do. I was about to ask her to call security when he suddenly backed off, giving me this strange, hard look. He said, "All right, if that's how it is," and turned to walk away. The attendant let me board, but I couldn't shake the feeling that he was still watching me. I kept looking over my shoulder, but he was gone. I took my seat, trying to breathe, trying to convince myself it was over, that he'd just gotten a bit too attached, a bit too lonely. But a few minutes later, as I was buckling in, I saw him again. He was standing at the entrance to the plane, talking to one of the flight attendants. I couldn't hear what he was saying, but he kept looking down the aisle, looking right at me. I felt trapped. I wanted to hide, but there was nowhere to go. I sank into my seat, praying he wouldn't come any closer. The flight attendants eventually shook their heads, and he was forced to leave. He shot me one last look as he turned away, his eyes cold and furious. The door finally closed, and I let out a breath I didn't realize I'd been holding. The rest of the flight was tense, but at least he was gone. When we landed, I grabbed my bags and rushed out, practically running through the airport. I kept looking over my shoulder, half expecting to see him following me again. But he wasn't there. I went to this small coastal village for a break. Work had been rough, and I needed a quiet place, somewhere out of the way. It looked perfect online, just a handful of houses, a couple of local spots to eat, cliffs with ocean views. I rented a little house at the edge of the village, close enough to the water that you could hear it at night, just crashing against the shore. The first morning, I went out to explore. It was early, maybe 7 or 8, and there wasn't much movement around. A couple of people walked by, but no one really looked at me. I was the stranger in town, after all, just a tourist. I didn't expect anyone to be overly friendly, but I didn't expect the stares either. When I stopped at a little cafe on the main road, I got my coffee and sat by the window, just watching the place come to life. A few people walked by, giving me a glance, then another. After a few minutes, I noticed 2 people, then 3, just standing across the street. They weren't talking or anything, just staring at me through the glass. I tried to shake it off. It was a small town. Maybe they didn't get many visitors. I finished my coffee and left, walking around the village a bit more. But no matter where I went, I felt it. People glancing at me, eyes following me around. A few times, I stopped and looked back at them, and they'd turn away, acting like they hadn't been watching. By the afternoon, I started feeling more uncomfortable. I'd gone down to the beach, hoping the waves and open air would clear my head, but even there, I could feel it. 2 men were sitting up by the cliffs, not too far off, just watching. Not talking, just watching. I waved, and one of them lifted his hand halfway, but neither smiled. They just stared. Later, I went back to the house, thinking maybe I'd just keep to myself for the night. But the unease stuck with me. I kept looking out the windows, half expecting to see someone outside. By then, it was dark, and I could barely make out the street. But I swore I saw someone standing by the lamppost outside. They didn't move or come closer. They were just there, in the shadows. The next morning, I tried to push it out of my head. I went into town to pick up some groceries. As I paid for everything, I tried chatting with the woman at the register, asking her about the area, if there were any good hiking trails or spots to see. She just shook her head and said she didn't know. When I asked again, she gave me this blank look and just took my money. No change, nothing. She walked away before I could even ask for a receipt. I was starting to get frustrated. It felt like everyone was hiding something, but I couldn't understand what. Everywhere I went, I got the same look. People wouldn't answer my questions, just stared or turned away. By the 3rd day, I felt like I was going crazy. I hadn't talked to anyone properly, and every attempt to get a straight answer was shut down. I went back to the cafe, hoping maybe the staff would warm up if they saw me enough times. There was a man behind the counter, and I decided to try my luck with him. I asked about the beach, about the cliffs, just anything to get a conversation going. He looked at me for a long time, like he was trying to decide if he should say something, and finally, he just said, "You shouldn't have come here." Then he walked into the back, leaving me standing there alone. That was it for me. I went back to my rental and started packing up. I didn't even care if I lost the money, I just wanted to leave. But as I packed, I noticed a note slipped under the door. It was an old piece of paper, the edges frayed, like it had been torn from a notebook. It said, "Stay inside tonight. Don't go out. Don't look out." I felt this cold chill run through me. I didn't know who left it or why, but it was clear that whoever they were, They didn't want me here. I thought about leaving right then, but it was already dark, and I had no idea what the roads were like at night. So I decided to wait until morning. I locked the doors, checked the windows twice, and then sat on the couch, staring at the note, reading it over and over, wondering what they meant by "don't look out." I kept telling myself it was probably just a prank, someone messing with the outsider, but I couldn't shake the feeling. Around midnight, I heard footsteps outside. Slow, steady footsteps on the gravel path leading up to the door. My heart started racing. I wanted to look, but I kept hearing that note in my head. I stayed where I was, silent, barely breathing, listening. The footsteps came closer, stopping right outside the door. I thought I'd see a shadow pass by the window, but there was nothing. Just silence. After a few minutes, I heard another set of footsteps, then another, like more people were gathering outside. I didn't move. I felt frozen, trapped in my own house, listening as people I couldn't see started moving around the building, pacing, stopping, pacing again. I thought I heard whispering, but it was too faint to make out. The sounds continued all night. I didn't sleep, didn't dare to. I just sat there, waiting for it to end. At some point, just before dawn, the footsteps faded away, and the silence returned. When the sun finally came up, I packed my things, grabbed my keys, and didn't even look back. As I drove out of town, I saw people watching from their windows, from their porches, just standing there, following me with their eyes until I was gone. To this day, I don't know what they wanted, why they acted the way they did, or what they would have done if I'd opened that door. I just know I'll never go back. I was at the gym after work, my usual spot. It was pretty packed at night, but I'd managed to find a small area near the back to do my workout in peace. I was in the middle of a set, facing the mirror, when I noticed a guy a few benches over. He was watching me. At first, I thought maybe he was just zoning out or tired. It happens, right? You just look somewhere and don't even realize you're staring. But every time I looked up, there he was, staring back at me, through the mirror, not even trying to hide it. It was strange enough that I started feeling uneasy. I kept telling myself not to be paranoid, to just keep doing my workout and ignore him. But even after I changed machines, he was still there, always in view. I looked around a few times to see if he was looking at someone else, maybe standing near me or behind me. But no, it was just me. I wrapped up faster than usual, heading over to the weights to finish up. I kept my head down, focused, hoping he'd lose interest. But every time I glanced up, there he was, leaning against a machine, watching me through the mirror. His expression wasn't angry or aggressive, just intense, unblinking. When I was done, I went to the locker room, relieved to finally be away from him. I was putting my stuff into my bag when I noticed something folded up, tucked right in the front pocket. It was a small piece of paper, almost like it had been torn out of a notebook. I opened it, and all it said was, "I like watching you." My stomach dropped. I hadn't put that there. Nobody else would have touched my bag, and I hadn't noticed anyone come up to it. I looked around the locker room, hoping he wasn't in there, but I was alone. I grabbed my bag and got out of there, fast. As I walked to my car, I kept looking around, trying to spot him. I didn't see him anywhere. It was dark in the parking lot, so I just hurried, got in, locked the doors, and drove home. The whole way, I felt on edge, like maybe he was following me, but when I checked the rearview mirror, there was no one there. Still, I kept checking, feeling like I couldn't be too sure. The next day, I wasn't planning on going back to the gym, but I had this feeling, like I needed to see if he'd be there again, like maybe I'd imagined it or overreacted. So I went, but earlier, thinking maybe I'd avoid him that way. The place was quieter, only a few people around, and I didn't see him anywhere, which was a relief. I went through my workout, feeling more relaxed, but as I moved over to the weights, I glanced up and there he was, watching me from across the room, like he'd been there all along. I tried to ignore him, focusing on finishing quickly so I could leave, but then he started moving closer, machine by machine, getting nearer every time I looked up. It felt like he was cornering me, slowly, so I decided to cut my workout short. I picked up my bag, heading straight for the exit without looking back. My heart was racing, but I kept my head down and didn't turn around, just focused on getting out of there. When I got to my car, I looked around, making sure he hadn't followed. The lot was empty. I got in and drove home, telling myself I wouldn't go back, at least not for a while. But that night, I felt this uneasy feeling, like someone was watching me, even in my own apartment. The next morning, I decided to check my gym bag, just to make sure there was nothing else in there. When I opened it, I found another note. It was folded up, same as before, and this time it said, "You look scared." I like that. My skin went cold. I hadn't even taken my bag out since coming home, and I knew it had been empty when I left the gym. I locked all my doors, checking every window, every corner of my apartment. I couldn't shake the feeling that he'd been there, somehow. I spent the rest of the day feeling tense, jumping at every little noise. I wanted to report it, but I didn't have any proof. What could I even say? That some guy I didn't know was staring at me and left creepy notes? I wasn't even sure who he was. After a few days, I forced myself to go back to the gym. It sounds crazy, I know, but I felt like I couldn't let him scare me out of my own routine. I went during the day, hoping it would be busy enough to make me feel safer. As I walked in, I scanned the room, checking every corner, but he wasn't there. I felt a mix of relief and paranoia, wondering if he'd show up again. I went through my workout, keeping my head down, just wanting to get it over with. But as I finished and headed to the locker room, I caught a glimpse of him standing by the entrance, watching me with that same, steady stare. He didn't move, didn't say anything, just stood there, as if he knew I'd look over. I didn't stop to shower or change, just grabbed my things and left as fast as I could. I didn't look back until I was in my car, and even then, I couldn't shake the feeling that he'd follow me home. I drove around for a while, trying to lose him, even though I hadn't seen him behind me. When I finally got home, I went straight inside, locked the door, and just sat there, trying to calm down. That night, I barely slept. I kept hearing noises, creaks, like someone was outside. Every time I got up to check, there was nothing there. I knew it was probably just my mind playing tricks on me, but I couldn't relax. The next morning, I called the gym, asking if they had any complaints about a man harassing members. They said they hadn't, and when I tried to describe him, they didn't seem to know who I was talking about. I asked about the security footage, thinking maybe they'd have a record of him being there, but they told me the cameras were down that week for maintenance. It's been a few weeks now, and I haven't gone back to that gym. I haven't seen him anywhere else, but sometimes, late at night, I still get that feeling, like he's there, watching. Like he's just waiting for me to come back. The road was dead empty. It was nearly midnight, and I was somewhere on a stretch of highway between towns, just trees and darkness on either side. I'd been driving for hours, and I was starting to feel it, the weight in my eyes, the ache in my shoulders. When I saw the dim glow of a diner sign up ahead, it felt like a small miracle. The parking lot was empty, but I pulled in anyway, deciding I could use a coffee or something to stay alert. The diner looked like it had been there forever, faded paint and a cracked open sign in the window. I stepped inside, and the bell over the door gave a tired little jingle. There was a woman behind the counter, maybe in her late 40s, with her hair pulled back and a warm smile that reached her eyes. She looked like the kind of person who'd been working nights here for years. The place was empty except for her. "Long drive?" she asked as I sat down at the counter. "Yeah, just trying to keep going, but I needed a break," I replied, glancing around. The whole place felt old, like a relic from a different time, but it was clean. Cozy, even, in that quiet kind of way. She poured me a cup of coffee without asking, setting it in front of me along with a small plate of toast. "On the house," she said with a smile. "Thanks, I appreciate it." I took a sip, grateful for the warmth. Not a lot of places open this late. "Not a lot of folks on the road this late," she said, her smile fading just a little. There was something in her eyes, a hint of worry, maybe, but she didn't say anything else, just went back to wiping down the counter. I finished the coffee and toast, feeling more awake and ready to get moving. I stood up, reaching for my wallet, but she shook her head. "Don't worry about it," she said, her tone friendly but firm. "You just take care out there." I thanked her, a little taken aback, and made my way to the door. But just as I reached for the handle, she called out, "Wait a second, could you, help me with something in the back?" I hesitated, feeling a bit uncomfortable, but she was looking at me with this hopeful expression, and I didn't want to be rude. "Sure, I guess," I said, following her behind the counter and through a door that led into a small, dimly lit storage area. She pointed to a stack of boxes on a high shelf. "Could you just bring one of those down for me?" "I've been meaning to get to it all night," she said, smiling again, though her eyes didn't seem as friendly now. I grabbed one of the boxes and handed it to her, and she held it for a second before setting it down, still looking at me in that strange way. "Thank you," she said softly, almost like she was sad. "No problem," I replied, edging back towards the door. "I should probably hit the road now." She nodded but looked at me with that same sad expression. "You sure you don't want to stay a little longer? Maybe get another coffee?" I felt a twinge of unease. "No, I've got a lot of driving ahead of me." She didn't say anything to that, just gave me a small nod. I went back to the door and reached for the handle, but as I turned to leave, she cleared her throat. "You know, there's a storm coming," she said, her voice soft but firm. "It might be safer to stay here a while longer." I glanced out the window, confused. The sky was clear, no hint of clouds or rain. "I think I'll be okay," I said, trying to keep my tone light, but there was a nervous edge to my voice. Something felt off. She just nodded, watching me with that same expression, like she knew something I didn't. "Well, just be careful. Sometimes, you don't see what's coming until it's too late." I forced a smile, feeling a strange chill. "Thanks, I will." As I stepped outside, I looked back, expecting her to still be standing there, but she'd disappeared behind the counter. I felt a wave of relief as I walked to my car, more eager than ever to get back on the road. I started the engine, putting the diner behind me, but as I pulled onto the highway, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. Her words kept echoing in my head, that strange look in her eyes. I kept driving, telling myself I was being paranoid. Maybe she was just lonely, looking for someone to talk to. Or maybe she was trying to be friendly, to give some advice. I brushed it off, focusing on the road. About 20 minutes later, the sky darkened fast. There hadn't been a cloud in sight when I'd left, but now there was a thick, heavy fog creeping over the road. The headlights barely cut through it, and I had to slow down to almost a crawl just to see where I was going. I thought about turning around, going back to the diner, but something about that place made me uneasy now. I didn't want to go back. I kept driving, gripping the wheel tightly, my eyes straining to see through the fog. The road felt different, winding and unfamiliar. I didn't remember it being so narrow, and every turn seemed sharper, every hill steeper. My hands were starting to sweat, and I kept glancing in the rearview mirror, half expecting to see headlights behind me, but the road was empty. After what felt like forever, I saw a sign up ahead, its letters barely visible in the fog. I slowed down, squinting to read it, and my heart skipped a beat. It was the same diner sign, the same faded letters, glowing softly in the distance. I stopped the car, staring in disbelief. There was no way I'd circled back. I'd been driving straight the whole time. But there it was, the same empty parking lot, the same old diner. I told myself it was a coincidence, maybe another diner with the same name, but something inside me knew better. I pulled into the lot, my hands shaking as I gripped the wheel. I didn't want to go back inside, but I couldn't stay out here, not with the fog closing in around me. I stepped out of the car and walked back to the diner, feeling like I was in a nightmare I couldn't wake up from. The bell over the door jingled as I stepped inside, and there she was, standing behind the counter, smiling at me like she'd been waiting. "Welcome back," she said, her voice calm, like she'd known I'd returned. I opened my mouth to ask how this was possible, but the words wouldn't come. She just looked at me, that sad, knowing look in her eyes. "Sometimes," she said softly, "it's best to stay put when the road isn't safe. Some things out there, they don't want you to leave." I didn't know what to say, didn't know how to respond. I just stood there, feeling trapped, like I was stuck in some strange loop. The fog outside pressed against the windows, thick and heavy, and I realized I didn't want to go back out there. Not tonight. She poured me another cup of coffee and set it in front of me. "Stay a while," she said, almost like it was an order. And I did, sitting there in that empty diner, with the fog outside and the strange, silent comfort of the woman watching over me. I don't know how long I stayed. Maybe just a few hours, maybe all night. But when the fog finally lifted, when the first hint of dawn broke through the windows, I felt like I'd escaped something. Something I was never meant to see. And as I drove away, I couldn't shake the feeling that I'd been saved, or spared, somehow, by staying just a little longer. It was supposed to be a break from everything: work, people, noise. Just me, alone in a small cabin tucked away deep in the woods. I'd saved up to get it for the week, just to be somewhere quiet, with nothing but the trees and my own thoughts. There was a dirt path winding through the forest to get here, and I'd barely seen another car since I turned off the main road. Just that tiny cabin and miles of trees in every direction. It was perfect. Or it should have been. My first day went exactly how I wanted. I didn't have my phone on, no connection to anything but nature. I spent hours walking the trails around the cabin, just breathing, letting myself unwind. When it got dark, I built a small fire, ate a simple dinner I'd brought, and went to bed, feeling more relaxed than I had in years. The next morning, though, things felt different. When I opened the cabin door, there was a note on the porch, just sitting there on the wood. A folded sheet of plain white paper. I picked it up, a little surprised but mostly confused. I hadn't told anyone where I was staying, and I hadn't seen anyone since I'd arrived. I opened it, and my stomach dropped. The note was short, only one sentence: "I saw you sitting by the fire." That was it. No name, no signature, nothing. I stood there, staring at the words for what felt like minutes, my mind scrambling for an explanation. Maybe someone had passed by, maybe a hiker? But it didn't make sense. I was miles from any trail, and the place was so remote I couldn't imagine anyone just happening to come by. I tried to shake it off. It was probably a prank, someone just messing around. But it left a sour feeling in my stomach the rest of the day. I couldn't fully relax, my eyes constantly darting to the windows, expecting to see someone, anyone out there. But there was nothing. Just the quiet trees swaying in the wind. That night, I made sure all the doors and windows were locked tight. I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched, but I forced myself to stay calm, to remind myself that I was safe, alone. But when morning came, there was another note waiting for me on the porch. This one was worse. I watched you check the locks last night. My hands shook as I read it. There was no way anyone should have known what I'd done after dark, not unless they'd been close. Very close. I looked around, scanning the trees, but it was the same empty forest I'd been in all week. I tried to convince myself it was still some weird prank, but my mind kept coming back to the same question: who could have done this? The forest felt different after that, too silent, almost too close. I walked the perimeter of the cabin, trying to look for any sign of someone, footprints, broken branches, anything that would tell me someone had been there. But there was nothing. Just leaves and dirt, undisturbed. I thought about leaving that night, but I forced myself to stay. It was just a few more days, and I didn't want to give in to some strange prank. But every sound that night, every creak, every rustle outside, had me jumping out of my skin. I barely slept. The next morning, I was almost too scared to open the door. But I did, and there it was again, another note, just lying there like it was waiting for me. You didn't sleep well, did you? I felt like my blood turned to ice. Whoever this was, they knew everything I was doing, almost as if they were inside the cabin with me. I started to wonder if maybe they had been, at least at some point. The cabin wasn't exactly secure, just a couple of simple locks and old windows. And I'd been asleep, completely unaware, alone in the middle of nowhere. I felt trapped, my mind racing with options. I could leave, get in the car and drive off, but there was no guarantee whoever this was wouldn't just follow me, or that they weren't already planning to show up somewhere else. By now, I felt sick, barely able to eat or even think clearly. I spent the day by the windows, keeping watch, expecting to see someone at any moment. But the woods were still, empty, and it started to feel like the silence was taunting me. It was like I was waiting for something, but I didn't know what. That night, I barely turned out the lights. I sat up, watching the door, the windows, everything. I tried to stay awake, convinced I'd see someone trying to get in, but eventually, exhaustion took over, and I drifted off. When I opened the door the next morning, I was already numb, dreading what I knew would be there. And it was a fourth note, lying there, folded neatly on the porch. You look tired. My hands were trembling as I read it. This wasn't just someone playing around, this was something else. This was personal. Someone knew me, watched me, and was getting closer, bit by bit, each day. I could feel it. And they wanted me to know it, too. I felt it in the way they wrote, in how they left the notes exactly where I'd see them. I couldn't take it anymore. I didn't pack, I didn't even stop to think. I just grabbed my car keys, barely stopping to lock the door behind me, and left. I drove down that winding road as fast as I could, my heart pounding the whole way. I didn't care if I left anything behind, didn't care about anything but getting away from that place, away from those woods and those notes. It wasn't until I was halfway down the main road that I started to breathe again, my hands finally relaxing on the wheel. I drove straight home, barely stopping, not daring to look back in case I'd see someone standing there, watching me leave. A part of me felt like I was being paranoid, like maybe it really was a prank, but something deep down told me it wasn't. I never went back to that cabin, never even told anyone the full story. But sometimes, when I'm alone in a quiet room, I still feel like I'm being watched. Like maybe I left something behind in that forest, something that's still following me, even now. I didn't expect anything weird to happen that night. Me, Dan, and Aaron had been talking about checking out this old warehouse just outside of town for a while. It wasn't something I'd normally do, to be honest, but they kept saying we had to go before it got demolished. So on Friday, just after dark, we drove over. The warehouse looked like it had been abandoned for years. It was huge, this big, empty building with rusted metal walls and broken windows. We parked down the street a bit, just in case someone spotted us, but the place looked dead quiet. Even from a distance, I could tell it had been empty for a long time. Dan had brought some flashlights, and the three of us climbed through a broken window on the side. The place was mostly empty inside, with a lot of wide open space and rows of old shelves covered in dust. Pieces of junk, broken boxes, old machines, and stuff were scattered everywhere. It felt like the kind of place where you'd expect to hear an echo, but when we talked, it sounded weirdly muffled. At first, it was just us laughing, joking around. We were taking turns daring each other to explore different parts of the building. Aaron kept saying there was an old office somewhere toward the back with a bunch of graffiti on the walls, and he wanted to find it. We were mostly sticking together, but the place was so big it was easy to lose track of each other. After a while, I noticed it was quieter than it should have been. I turned around, and I realized that Dan and Aaron weren't right behind me like they had been. I called out for them, but there was no response. Just silence. I figured they were messing with me, so I kept walking, thinking I'd catch up to them or that they'd jump out to scare me. I kept going through these narrow walkways between the shelves, shining my flashlight ahead of me. The light would catch on broken crates and metal scraps, casting weird shadows that made everything look twisted. I felt uneasy but kept pushing forward. I turned a corner, expecting to see Dan or Aaron, but instead, I saw someone else. He was standing still, like he'd been waiting for me to walk around the corner. He was just there, in the shadows, staring at me. He was older, maybe late 40s, and he looked rough, like he hadn't had a decent night's sleep in ages. His clothes were dirty, and his eyes looked hollow. For a second, I thought maybe he was homeless, someone who'd been living there. I froze, not sure what to say. He didn't move. Just stood there, watching me. Finally, he spoke, his voice low and cold. "Why are you here?" I tried to sound casual, like I hadn't been scared out of my mind just seeing him. "I'm just looking around." "Here with some friends," I said, glancing around, hoping Dan or Aaron would suddenly appear and give me an excuse to get out of there. The man's face tightened, and he took a step forward, his eyes fixed on me in this intense way that made my skin crawl. "Who told you it was safe?" That question threw me off. "What?" "No one told me anything. We just wanted to check the place out." "It's empty, right?" He stared at me, not blinking, like he was trying to read my mind or see if I was lying. I felt a chill run down my spine. It didn't feel like a simple question. It felt like he was testing me somehow. I held my flashlight tighter, realizing how alone I felt. The beams of light from Dan and Aaron's flashlights were nowhere to be seen, and it was starting to sink in that I was completely on my own. "Who told you to come here?" he repeated, this time more insistent, his voice louder. His tone had this edge to it, something I couldn't quite place, but it sounded like he was angry. Angry that I was there. I had no idea what to say. I just kept repeating, "No one. No one told me anything. Then he shook his head, muttering something under his breath, something I couldn't make out. He took another step toward me, and I found myself backing up instinctively. My pulse was racing. I could feel my palms start to sweat. I didn't understand why he was so worked up, why he cared that I was there. But something in his face, the way he kept staring, made me feel like I was in danger, like he didn't want me to leave. "You shouldn't have come here," he said slowly, as if he was spelling out something obvious. "People don't just wander in here." I tried to steady my voice, hoping to keep him calm. "Look, I'm just here with some friends. We'll leave, all right? We're not causing any trouble." His eyes flickered when I mentioned my friends, like he was looking past me to see if anyone else was around. That's when it hit me that he'd been alone when I first saw him, hadn't looked in any other direction but mine. Like he knew, somehow, I'd be alone. The silence felt thick around us, like the air was heavy with something wrong, something tense. He reached into his jacket, and I thought my heart would explode. My mind started racing, wondering if I should run, but my feet felt frozen to the floor. "You think you know this place," he said, his voice a low growl. "You think it's just an old building. But you don't understand." I tried to say something, but my throat felt dry, like I couldn't force the words out. I just nodded, hoping he'd take it as agreement. I'd never felt this scared, this close to something I couldn't understand. This wasn't just some abandoned warehouse to him. I didn't know what it was, but it was more than that, something darker, something he wasn't going to let go of. After what felt like forever, he slowly moved back, still keeping his eyes on me. "Get out. And don't come back." I didn't wait to be told twice. I turned and practically ran down the aisle, my heart hammering so hard I could hear it in my ears. I didn't stop to look back, didn't check if he was following me. I just ran, weaving through the shelves, desperately trying to remember the way out. When I finally spotted the broken window we'd come in through, I felt a rush of relief. Outside, I saw Dan and Aaron standing by the car, looking around like they'd been waiting for me. I ran up to them, out of breath, my mind still reeling. They looked at me like I was crazy, asking what had taken me so long. I tried to explain, to tell them about the man inside, but I could barely get the words out. They didn't believe me at first. Thought I was joking, that I'd made it up just to scare them. But the look in my eyes must have convinced them I was serious, and without another word, we all piled into the car and left that place as fast as we could. To this day, I don't know who that man was or why he was so set on scaring me away. But I still feel that fear when I think about it, the way he looked at me, like he knew me, like he'd been expecting me somehow. It was late, maybe past midnight, and I was on the subway heading home. The station was nearly empty when I boarded, just a few people scattered here and there, heads down, probably as tired as I was. I found a seat near the middle of the car, leaned back, and let out a long breath. I'd worked a double shift and was so trained I barely noticed anyone else around me. As the train rattled through the tunnels, I saw someone at the far end of the car, a man sitting by himself, watching me. I figured maybe he was just zoning out, like I was, so I looked away, trying not to think much of it. But a few minutes later, I glanced up and saw he was still looking right at me, not moving, not blinking. Just staring. It was uncomfortable, but I tried to ignore him. People get weird on public transport sometimes. I thought maybe he'd get off soon, or lose interest. But as the train pulled into the next station and a few people got off, I noticed he stayed put, his eyes still fixed on me. I tried looking down, messing with my phone, acting like I didn't see him. After a few more stops, the feeling got worse. I looked up again, thinking he might have looked away by now, but he was still staring, completely still, just his eyes locked on me from across the car. It didn't feel normal. It wasn't a casual look either, it was like he was studying me, waiting. I felt a tightness in my chest and made a quick decision to change cars. It wasn't my stop yet, but I didn't care. I stood up, kept my head down, and moved through the door to the next car. The car I moved to was emptier. A couple of seats down, an older woman was dozing off, her head bobbing with the movements of the train. I felt a bit of relief seeing her there. I found a seat near the front and sat down, trying to shake off the uncomfortable feeling that had crawled under my skin. But not 2 minutes later, I felt it, the prickling sensation of being watched. I glanced back, and there he was, standing at the door, having just entered the car. He didn't sit down, he just stayed near the door, gripping one of the poles and looking at me. He had this strange smile, like he knew something I didn't, like he was enjoying how uncomfortable he was making me. I told myself it was just some creep, maybe someone looking for attention, and that I'd get off at the next station and be done with it. But every time I thought about his eyes, my skin crawled. I had another 2 stops to go until my usual station, and part of me wanted to stay on until then, just out of habit. But something in my gut told me that waiting wasn't a good idea. So, as soon as we reached the next stop, I got up quickly and walked to the door, hoping he'd just let me go. I stepped onto the platform, pretending like I was heading for the exit, and waited until the doors were about to close, thinking I'd hop back on the train at the last second to lose him. But right as I stepped back toward the doors, he was there, standing just a few feet away, smiling at me in this strange way, like he knew exactly what I was doing. My stomach dropped. I froze, standing there as he just looked at me, waiting. The doors closed before I could make a move, and the train pulled away, leaving us both on the platform. I looked around, but the platform was empty. It was just the 2 of us, standing there. I started walking, hoping he'd stay behind, but I could hear his footsteps following me, slow and steady, not hurrying, like he knew I wasn't going anywhere. I thought about running, but the stairs to the exit felt miles away. At the end of the platform was another set of stairs leading down to a connecting tunnel. I didn't know where it went, but I took it anyway, just wanting to get away from him. I walked quickly, my steps echoing in the empty tunnel, hoping he'd stop following, that he'd give up. But his footsteps followed me, steady, never getting closer, but never falling behind. The tunnel twisted and turned, and I realized I was completely alone, the only light coming from the dim, flickering bulb spaced too far apart. I could hear him behind me, just out of sight, but close enough that I knew he was still there. My heart was pounding so hard I could barely hear anything else. I tried to move faster, hoping there'd be an exit soon, but the tunnel seemed to stretch on forever. And then, I reached a dead end. I turned around, and there he was, standing at the other end of the tunnel, just watching me, that same smile on his face, like he'd won some sort of game. I took a step back, my back pressed against the wall, feeling trapped. There was no way out. He didn't say anything, just watched me, his eyes glinting in the dim light, taking his time. I could see his chest rising and falling, slow and steady, like he was savoring every second. My mind was racing, trying to figure out what to do. I thought about yelling, but who would hear me down there? There was no one around. My phone was in my pocket, but my hands were shaking too much to reach for it. Then, he took a step closer, his face still calm, still watching me. I could see his eyes more clearly now, dark and empty, like there was nothing behind them. I don't know how long we stood there, but finally, he took another step, and I felt this rush of fear, stronger than anything I'd ever felt. I knew he was about to do something, something bad, something I didn't want to know. In that moment, I did the only thing I could think of. I ran, ducking past him, pushing him out of the way, hoping he wouldn't grab me. I ran back through the tunnel, not looking back, just running as fast as I could, my breath coming in short gasps, my heart pounding so loud it hurt. When I reached the platform again, I looked back, expecting him to be right behind me, but he wasn't there. The tunnel was empty, just this long, dark stretch leading to nowhere. I waited, listening, but there was nothing, no footsteps, no sound at all. I didn't know where he'd gone, but I wasn't going to stick around to find out. As soon as the next train came, I got on, my legs shaking, my mind still racing, unable to shake the feeling of his eyes on me. That strange smile burned into my memory. It was supposed to be a weekend of peace, just me, my tent, and the quiet of the woods. I had packed my gear the night before, excited for the chance to disconnect and enjoy nature. After a long drive, I found a secluded spot near a small lake, set up my camp, and built a fire. The sun had dipped behind the trees, leaving a crisp chill in the air. I sat by the fire, listening to the sounds of the forest, and felt the weight of the world lift from my shoulders. That night, I roasted some marshmallows and listened to the crackling of the fire. I was tired but content. I finally crawled into my tent, zipped it up, and closed my eyes, allowing the soft sounds of the night to lull me to sleep. Hours later, I woke suddenly, not knowing why. My eyes adjusted to the dim light filtering through the tent. Something felt off, but I couldn't put my finger on it. I listened, and that's when I heard it, the soft crackle of the fire. I had not put more wood on it before going to sleep. Curiosity piqued, I slowly unzipped my tent and peeked outside. The fire flickered, casting long shadows in the night. As I scanned the area, I saw someone sitting by the fire. They were facing away from me, their silhouette outlined by the flames. My heart dropped. Who was that? I cleared my throat, trying to sound brave. Hello? The figure didn't move or respond. Just sat there, perfectly still. I hesitated, my heart racing. I took a deep breath, hoping it was just another camper who lost their way or something harmless. Excuse me, do you need help? Nothing. Just silence. I felt the cold creeping up my spine. There was something unsettling about the way they sat there, as if they were not a person at all but a statue. I took a cautious step out of my tent, the ground crunching beneath my feet. Hello? I tried again, my voice firmer this time. I stepped closer to the fire, hoping the light would chase away the creeping fear inside me. As I got nearer, I could see their outline more clearly. They wore dark clothes, and their hair hung down, partially obscuring their face. The flames flickered, casting strange shadows on their features. I took another step, and that's when they turned slowly to face me. I could not see their eyes, just a shadowy void where their face should be. It felt wrong, like looking at something I was not meant to see. My stomach churned, and every instinct told me to turn and run, but I stood frozen, my feet glued to the ground. What are you doing here? I managed to ask, my voice shaking. The figure just stared at me. I could feel the weight of their gaze pressing down, but still, they did not speak. It was like time had stopped. I could hear my heart pounding in my ears, the crackling of the fire almost drowned out by the sound of my breath. Suddenly, the figure stood up. I instinctively took a step back, my mind racing. Wait. I called out, not knowing what I hoped to achieve. They did not respond. Instead, they turned and began to walk into the darkness, away from the light of the fire. I watched in disbelief, unable to move. They moved silently, as if they were part of the night, blending into the shadows. "Who are you?" I shouted after them, panic rising in my throat. But they continued to walk, not glancing back, just disappearing into the trees. I felt a rush of fear as adrenaline coursed through my veins. I didn't think, just reacted. I ran after them, pushing through the brush, branches snapping underfoot. "Hey!" I yelled, desperate for an answer, desperate for anything. But they were gone. I stumbled to a stop, breathless and shaking, the darkness closing in around me. I turned back toward my camp, realizing how isolated I was out there. I could barely see the glow of my fire now. I hurried back, heart racing, feeling like I was being hunted. Once I reached the camp, I quickly grabbed my flashlight and scanned the trees, hoping to catch a glimpse of whoever or whatever that had been there. But nothing. The woods were silent, too silent. I felt exposed, vulnerable, as if something was watching me from the shadows. I felt the urge to pack up and leave right then, but part of me didn't want to give in to fear. I stood by the fire, the flames flickering wildly in the night air, creating a barrier of warmth and light around me. I forced myself to breathe, to calm down, but I could not shake the feeling of eyes upon me. After what felt like hours, I finally decided to stay awake, unwilling to let sleep claim me again. I sat there, my back against a tree, the fire crackling beside me. Every sound sent my heart racing, every rustle of leaves made me jump. The night dragged on, and I kept thinking about that figure. Who were they? What did they want? I kept replaying the moment in my head, trying to understand what had happened. It was just a strange encounter, right? But my instinct screamed that it was something more. Finally, as dawn broke, I heard the birds starting to sing. The light began to filter through the trees, pushing back the darkness. I took a deep breath, feeling a sense of relief wash over me. I decided I would pack up and leave, head back to my car and drive home. I began to gather my things, moving quickly. The sun was rising higher, and I felt safer with the light around me. As I packed, I kept glancing around, half expecting to see that figure again, but the woods were empty. I finished packing up my gear, feeling a weight lift from my shoulders. As I started to walk back to my car, I took one last look at the campfire. The ashes were cold, and the smoke drifted lazily into the air. I turned to leave, ready to put the whole experience behind me. But as I walked away, I heard something. A voice, soft and distant, just above a whisper. "You should not have come here." I froze, my heart racing again. I looked back at the fire, but there was no one there. Just me in the empty woods. The chill returned, creeping down my spine, but I didn't stop. I ran to my car, fumbling with the keys as I got in. I locked the doors, started the engine, and drove away, the woods shrinking in my rearview mirror. I decided to go hiking alone one weekend. I liked going by myself, didn't have to keep up with anyone, didn't have to worry about anyone else's pace. Plus, that day was perfect for it. The weather was clear, and I knew the trails well enough to not get lost. I'd hiked out here plenty of times, but never alone, and I guess I was feeling a bit more confident than usual. It started off like any other hike. Trees all around, only the sound of birds and the crunch of my boots on the dirt. But after about an hour, I started noticing something strange. Every now and then, I thought I heard footsteps behind me. They weren't close, not at first, but far enough that I couldn't tell for sure if it was just the sound of wind shaking branches or maybe an animal. I even stopped a couple of times to listen, holding my breath. But as soon as I stopped, the sound stopped too. I laughed it off, kept going. The sound would start again, only when I started walking. It was like an echo, but not quite, because it wasn't perfectly in sync with my steps. If I stepped slow, they stayed slow. If I sped up, they did too. That's when the weird feeling kicked in. I've felt uneasy in the woods before, like that quiet feeling where you wonder if someone's watching, but this was different. It wasn't just a feeling, there was something about those steps that just didn't sit right. After a while, I stopped again, this time longer, turning all the way around to look back down the trail. There was nothing there. No movement. Just trees and that never-ending line of the path going down. I was so sure I'd hear something if I waited long enough, but it was dead silent. I even called out, "Hello," just in case it was another hiker who was maybe shy or didn't want to pass me. No answer. I brushed it off again, thinking maybe it was a squirrel or just my imagination, and I kept going. But a part of me started feeling less and less okay with being out there alone. The sound would come and go. I tried walking as softly as I could, watching my own footsteps, seeing if maybe I was making the sounds myself without realizing. But every time, as soon as I took a step, those other footsteps seemed to fall right in line behind me. I thought about turning back. It had only been about 2 hours, but the whole thing was putting me on edge. My phone was in my pocket, but there wasn't any reception, and it wouldn't do me any good anyway. There was no one to call, no way out besides hiking back the way I came. Finally, I reached a part of the trail where it opens up a bit. The trees are spaced farther apart there, and I thought maybe if I got into the open, I'd be able to see more. But as soon as I entered that open stretch, I froze. My eyes landed on a tree just a little ways off the trail, where a piece of white paper was taped to the trunk, right at eye level. I don't know why I felt like I had to go up to it, but I did. The paper looked clean, like it hadn't been there long, and there was writing on it in big, bold letters. I'll never forget what it said. "Turn back now. You're not alone." My heart was pounding so hard I could barely hear anything over it. I took a step back from the tree, looking around, and I swear, for a second, I thought I saw something move way off to the side. Just a shadow between two trees. It could have been nothing, but after seeing that note, I wasn't about to take any chances. I took off back down the trail the way I came, trying to keep a steady pace but too freaked out to keep it together. My eyes kept darting around, looking behind me and then forward again, like every shadow was going to leap out at me. I felt stupid, honestly, for letting myself get so worked up, but that note, who would leave something like that out here? And why? But that wasn't even the worst part. After maybe 10 minutes of near jogging, I heard the footsteps again. Only this time, they were closer. I didn't dare turn around, but I knew they were there. That feeling of someone just behind you, breathing down your neck. I felt it so clearly, and even though I wanted to run, I was too scared to speed up and make noise. My legs were moving faster than I'd ever hiked before, my boots barely touching the ground with each step. I don't know how far I went like that, but I kept going, kept walking as fast as I could without breaking into a full-out sprint. But then, just as I was nearing the start of the trail again, I saw something on another tree. Another note, this time written in smaller letters, like it had been done quickly. "Turn around." My heart nearly stopped. I tried to keep going without looking back, but it was almost impossible. I'd never felt anything like that, like something was pulling at me, wanting me to turn and see whatever was behind me. I couldn't help it. I looked. There, a few yards back, was a figure. I couldn't see their face, not fully, but they were standing perfectly still, right in the middle of the trail, like they were waiting for me to notice them. My chest was tight, my breaths coming out fast, shallow. I didn't know what to do. They didn't move, didn't make a sound, just stood there with their hands at their sides, slightly hunched forward. It felt like an eternity, just staring at this figure in the distance, but then they took a step forward. Just one step, slow and careful, like they were testing the ground. My whole body jolted, and I turned, taking off as fast as I could without a second thought. I didn't care how much noise I made anymore, I just needed to get out of there. I ran faster than I ever thought possible, not stopping, not looking back. I knew the way, and as soon as I could see the parking lot up ahead, relief hit me like a wave. My car was still there, my one lifeline out of this nightmare, and I didn't look back until I'd flung myself inside and locked the doors. But that's when I saw it. Right on my windshield, under one of the wipers, was another note. I almost didn't want to read it, but I had to. This one was even shorter than the others, scrawled in the same messy handwriting. See you next time. I didn't waste a second. I turned the key, peeled out of there, and didn't stop until I was halfway back to town. I don't know who that person was, why they were following me, or how they even knew I was there. But I haven't gone back to that trail since. I was traveling back from a work trip, just waiting for my transfer at this train station a couple hours from home. My train wasn't due for another 40 minutes, so I was just killing time, wandering around, checking my phone now and then. At some point, I started feeling the coffee I'd had earlier catching up to me, so I went to find the restroom. The station itself was kind of run down, not dirty exactly, but worn. That restroom was empty when I went in, 3 stalls and a couple of urinals. No music, just the faint echo of a train announcement from outside. I went to the farthest stall and shut the door. I was sitting there, checking my phone to pass the time, when I noticed something out of the corner of my eye. There was something poking out from under the stall door across from me. At first, I thought maybe someone had dropped something, but then I realized it was moving slightly, shifting up and down, as if adjusting. It took me a second to process, but then I saw what it was, the lens of a phone camera. Someone was recording me. I froze. My heart started racing, but I kept still, trying not to make any sudden movements. I didn't want them to know I'd noticed. I felt sick, but I stayed as calm as I could, breathing slow, waiting. After what felt like forever, the phone finally pulled back, just as silently as it had come. I waited a couple of seconds, then stood up as quietly as possible, barely touching the stall walls. I listened. I didn't hear footsteps or anything, just silence, and I thought maybe they were still there. I felt trapped, like if I opened the door, they'd be right on the other side. My mind was racing, going through every option. Should I open it fast, scare them? Or wait and see if they left first? I decided I couldn't stay in there. I took a deep breath and opened the door, stepping out. I glanced around quickly, looking at the other stalls. Nothing. Empty. Whoever it was had left. I didn't waste any time. I went straight out of there. Back in the main part of the station, it felt safer, but I was still on edge, looking over my shoulder every few steps. I tried to calm down, telling myself it was probably just some creep who'd gotten what he wanted and left. But even with all the people around, I didn't feel right. Then, my phone buzzed. I didn't think anything of it at first, figured it was just a work email or something, but then I looked and saw it was a text from an unknown number. All it said was, "Nice to see you." I stopped walking, my stomach turning. I thought maybe it was someone messing with me, but then my phone buzzed again. "Hope you're enjoying your trip." I didn't respond. I looked around, searching faces, but no one seemed to be looking at me. Everyone was just moving along, like nothing was wrong. I shoved my phone back in my pocket and walked faster toward the station exit, thinking maybe I'd just wait outside where there were more people around. But then another text came through. Leaving already? I couldn't believe it. My hands started shaking. I'd seen enough movies to know that this wasn't a coincidence, but I couldn't figure out how they could know I was leaving, let alone what they were getting at. I didn't know if I should respond, but another message came before I had the chance to decide. You look a little nervous. It felt like a punch to the gut. That meant they were still watching. I took a breath and looked around, trying to act casual while scanning the station, but nothing. No one was paying me any special attention. I typed back, "Who's this?" I watched the screen, waiting, hoping they'd slip up and give me some hint. A few seconds later, the reply came through. "Don't worry about that. We're just having a little fun." I felt like I was going to be sick. I had this overwhelming feeling that whoever was doing this wasn't far away, maybe even close enough to see the expression on my face. I typed, "This isn't funny," and hit send. This time, there was a longer pause, and I thought maybe they'd finally given up. But just as I let out a breath, another message appeared. "Isn't it?" I didn't respond. Instead, I headed straight for the nearest security guard. He was standing by the main entrance, a big guy, older, looked like he'd seen a lot. I explained as quickly as I could, showing him the messages, telling him what happened in the restroom. He took my phone, scrolling through the texts, and frowned. "Have you tried calling this number?" he asked. I hadn't, so I pulled out my phone, dialed the number, and pressed call. It rang, but no one picked up. Just a normal ring, no busy signal, no weird noises. Just a regular, endless ring. The guard advised me to stay close to him, and he called in another security officer to help check the restroom in the station for anyone who might be acting suspicious. I stayed where I was, my back against the wall, watching them head toward the restroom while I kept looking around, nervous, but no one around me seemed unusual. Then, my phone buzzed again. I almost didn't want to look, but I did. The text said, "You really shouldn't have done that." I looked over at the guard, wanting to show him the message, but I was frozen, staring at the screen. Just then, one of the guards walked back over to me, shaking his head. "No one in there, and no sign of anything left behind," he said, looking around. I showed him the new text. He frowned, his face getting serious. He asked me to stay put, and then both guards left to check around the rest of the station, telling me they'd be right back. Alone, I felt completely vulnerable. I kept glancing around, gripping my phone tight, looking at every face that passed by, every figure in the distance. I tried to calm down, telling myself it was over, that the guards were on it. But my phone buzzed one last time. This time, it was a photo. A picture of me, taken just minutes before, standing in the same spot by the wall, looking as lost and scared as I felt. The message with it just said, "See you around." My stomach dropped. I looked around wildly, my head spinning, my breath caught in my throat. But I didn't see anyone holding up a phone, no one pointing a camera at me, no one acting like they were watching me. It felt like every single person in that station was in on it, every face a threat. When the guards came back, I told them about the picture, showed them the message, and one of them looked at the other, nodding slightly. They told me to wait right there, then they brought in another officer. I went through the whole story again, every detail, every text. They asked for my phone and took it to the back, saying they'd try to trace the number, find out where the messages were coming from. The next train home was announced over the loudspeakers, and they advised me to board, saying they'd follow up. I didn't argue. I just wanted to leave. I got on that train, found my seat, and just sat there, looking out the window. I didn't get any more messages on the ride home, and I barely slept that night. A couple of days later, I got a call from the station security. They told me they couldn't trace the number. It was from some throwaway line that disconnected as soon as I'd left the station. They checked the cameras, but the quality wasn't good enough to make out any faces clearly. No leads, they said. It's been months now, but every time I'm out, every time I get on a train, I feel that same prickling on the back of my neck. Like someone's watching. Like somewhere, someone has a picture of me, just waiting for the right moment. I was on my first real vacation, the kind where I didn't have to think about work or check emails. I'd saved up for months and had this whole plan for what I wanted to do: see the city, try the food, buy a few things to bring back home. So, on one of my first days, I decided to go to this marketplace everyone kept talking about. They said it was huge, with endless stalls selling everything from food to clothes to trinkets. It was busy, crowded with tourists and locals, but I liked that. It felt alive, and I felt like I was part of something, even though I was just passing through. I started wandering from stall to stall, taking my time. Some people called out to get me to buy something, others ignored me. I went slow, looking at all the things they had. I bought a scarf from a lady who insisted I try it on first, then I stopped at a stall selling wooden carvings, admiring the work even though I didn't plan to buy anything. As I turned to leave the stall, I noticed a man standing a little ways back, not looking at anything in particular, just sort of standing there. He wasn't looking at me, but I could feel something off. He wasn't dressed like a tourist or a vendor, just in plain clothes, and he didn't have any bags or anything. I shrugged it off, figuring it was nothing. People stand around all the time, especially in places like that. I moved on, and after a few more stops, I forgot about him. I was deep into browsing some pottery when I glanced up, and there he was again, just a few stalls down. He was still keeping his distance, but it was clear he wasn't looking at anything for sale. He was just there, hands in his pockets, standing in the same way he had been before. I started feeling that uncomfortable prickle on my skin, like something wasn't right. I reminded myself I was in a crowded place, that there were plenty of people around. Still, I found myself moving to another part of the market, putting more distance between me and where I'd last seen him. I tried not to look around, but my eyes kept scanning the crowd as I moved. When I finally let myself look back, he was gone. I took a deep breath and tried to shake it off. The place was big, and people wandered all over. It wasn't weird to see the same person more than once. But I started moving faster, skipping over a few stalls and not really looking at things as closely. I stopped by a jewelry stall, some simple pieces that looked handmade, and tried to focus, to make myself enjoy being there. After a minute or two, I started to calm down again. But as I turned to the next stall, my heart nearly stopped. There he was, just a few feet away now, standing at the corner of a stall selling leather bags. He was closer this time, and now he was looking right at me. His face was blank, no expression, and he didn't move, didn't try to pretend he was interested in anything at the stall. He just stood there, staring. I looked away quickly, pretending to examine something on the table next to me, hoping he'd just walk away if I ignored him. I stayed like that for a minute, touching the items, flipping one over in my hand without even looking at it. But I could still feel his eyes on me. I risked a quick glance, and he was still there, not looking away, his gaze locked on me. Something in me snapped. I didn't care if I looked paranoid. I moved fast, weaving through the crowd toward the nearest exit I could see. I didn't know where it would take me, but I just wanted out of that market, away from him. I pushed past a couple people, probably seemed rude, but I was too scared to care. Once I got out of the main market area, I looked over my shoulder, half expecting to see him following me. But he wasn't there. I felt relief start to creep in, but I kept moving, putting more distance between me and the marketplace. I found a quieter street and slowed down, taking a moment to catch my breath. I leaned against a wall, trying to think of what to do next, and that's when I felt it, something folded in my pocket. I hadn't put anything there, so I reached in, thinking maybe I'd grabbed a business card or a receipt without remembering. But when I pulled it out, it was just a small slip of paper, neatly folded. I opened it up, and my stomach turned as I read the words written there, in handwriting that was almost too neat, too precise. "You're not safe here." My heart dropped. I looked around wildly, scanning every face, every shadow, but I didn't see anyone who looked like him, or anyone out of place. I thought maybe it was someone's idea of a joke, some messed up prank. But then I thought back to the man's blank expression, the way he'd followed me without speaking or looking away. It didn't feel like a joke. I folded the note and shoved it back in my pocket, feeling my hands start to shake. I kept looking around, checking behind me, as I tried to find my way back to the main street. All I wanted was to get somewhere open, somewhere I could get a cab or find help. But I'd taken so many turns trying to get away from him that I'd lost track of where I was. Every time I turned a corner, I expected to see him there, standing in that same still, quiet way. I could almost feel him behind me, that blank look, like he was studying me, waiting. The thought made me speed up, nearly breaking into a run, until I finally spotted an open square up ahead with a few people sitting on benches. I headed straight for it, nearly stumbling as I got closer, hoping I could lose myself in the small crowd. I didn't stop moving until I was right in the middle of the square, breathing hard, surrounded by people. I didn't know any of them, but I felt a strange comfort just being near them, hoping that if he was still following, he wouldn't come close with so many eyes around. I stayed like that, looking around, catching my breath, feeling the note burning in my pocket. After a few minutes, I finally started to relax. The marketplace was a few blocks back now, and I hadn't seen him since I'd left. Maybe he'd given up, or maybe he just wanted to scare me. Either way, I wasn't sticking around to find out. I caught a cab back to my hotel, locking the door behind me the second I got in. I didn't leave my room for the rest of the day, not even for dinner. I kept checking my pockets, as if more notes would appear out of nowhere, but there was just that one. Just those 4 words. "You're not safe here." I left the next day. I'd planned to stay a few more days, but I didn't feel right. Even when I got home, it took me weeks to feel like myself again. I never told anyone about it, didn't see the point, really. But every now and then, I find myself checking my pockets, half expecting to find another note. Just in case. It was late when I finally made it to the beach. I'd been driving all day, trying to get some distance from everything, from work, from people. Just needed some quiet. I found this spot down a winding road, tucked between cliffs, barely marked on the map. It was a wide, empty stretch of sand, nothing around but a few dark rocks scattered here and there, the waves crashing against them. I parked at the far end of the beach where there was no one else in sight, not a single other car. The sun was just starting to set, and the air was cool, just right. I took off my shoes, left them by the car, and walked toward the water. The sand was cold under my feet, but I didn't mind. It felt good, felt calm. I walked slowly, listening to the waves, watching the colors fade as the sky turned from orange to gray, then darker. I walked a while, thinking I'd go to the far end of the beach and then turn back, just to stretch my legs. After a bit, I looked back, just to see how far I'd gone. My footprints stretched out behind me in a straight line, and I was surprised by how far I'd already walked. There was no one else around, just me and my tracks in the sand, going back to where I'd parked. It felt good, having all that space to myself. As I kept going, I started to notice something strange. My footprints in the sand looked different. I don't know how to describe it at first. They were there, same size and shape, just like they should be. But it looked like they'd somehow gotten closer together. Like there were more of them, almost doubled up, like someone had been walking right behind me, stepping exactly in my tracks. I turned around, half expecting to see someone, but there was no one there. I didn't see anything unusual, just a darkening beach, the waves rolling in, my car a tiny dot in the distance. I shook my head, telling myself it was probably nothing. Maybe the wind had blown some of the sand over, making it look like there were more footprints. But I couldn't shake the feeling. I kept looking over my shoulder as I walked, expecting to see someone, but the beach was empty. Just me, the sand, and the waves. I told myself to keep going. The end of the beach wasn't far now. I'd walk to the end, turn around, and head back. I kept moving, ignoring the unease in my gut. Then, I stopped. I don't know what made me stop. Just a feeling. I looked down at my footprints again, and this time I noticed it for sure. There were two sets of prints, one mine, and another, right next to it. They were lined up so perfectly, step for step, that they matched my prints exactly. Same size, same shape, like a shadow, following my every move. My heart started pounding. I bent down, squatting next to one of the pairs, studying them closer. It was impossible. They were the exact same size as my feet, same width, same length, same everything. I looked up and down the beach, but there wasn't a soul in sight. Just empty sand stretching back to where I'd parked. I looked again, checking to see if maybe the prints went off somewhere else, like someone had crossed paths with me at some point and I'd missed it. But there was nothing. The tracks started right behind me, as if someone had just appeared and followed me exactly, step for step. I took a deep breath, tried to shake it off, and started walking back the way I'd come, heading toward my car. I kept my eyes forward, telling myself it was just some strange trick of the sand, maybe something to do with the way the light was fading. I kept moving, determined not to look back. But after a few steps, I couldn't help myself. I looked down, and my stomach twisted. The footprints were still there, right behind me, matching every single step. It was like someone was walking a few inches behind me, close enough that if I stopped, they would bump into me. I felt a chill run down my spine, the kind that makes the hair on the back of your neck stand up. I kept going, faster now, my heart pounding. I didn't want to look back, but I could feel it, feel the presence of those steps behind me, matching every move I made. I picked up my pace, almost jogging now, my breath coming quicker, the sound of the waves drowned out by the rush of blood in my ears. When I finally looked down again, my heart stopped. There, right beside my own tracks, were those same exact prints, step for step, as if they'd been etched into the sand at the same moment mine were. I glanced behind me, expecting to see someone finally, a person who could explain this, anything that made sense. But there was nothing. Just that same empty beach, fading into darkness. I broke into a run, not caring about how it looked or who might be watching from a distance. I ran as fast as I could, toward the spot where I'd parked my car, not looking down, not wanting to see if the tracks were still there, if they were still matching my every step. My feet pounded against the sand, and I could hear the sound of my own breaths, coming hard and fast. When I reached my car, I threw myself into the driver's seat, slamming the door shut behind me. I locked the doors, my hands shaking, and looked back at the beach through the window. The sun had almost completely set, casting everything in shadows, and for a second, I thought I saw a figure standing there, right where my last set of footprints stopped. But when I blinked, it was gone. I took a deep breath, trying to steady myself, and started the engine. I didn't look back as I drove away, didn't want to see the beach, the sand, or the tracks that might still be there, waiting. I just wanted to get as far away from that place as possible. It's been a few days since then, and I can't stop thinking about it. I keep checking my rearview mirror when I drive, glancing over my shoulder, feeling like there's someone just behind me, close enough to touch. I've tried to explain it to myself 100 different ways, tried to tell myself it was just shadows or some strange illusion. But every time I close my eyes, I see those footprints in the sand, perfect copies of my own, following right behind, step for step. There was this park near my place where I'd walk my dog, Penny, every day. It was a small, quiet park, mostly locals, lots of people with their own dogs. I'd started going there because it felt safe, and Penny loved it. We had a little routine, a loop around the park that took maybe 20 minutes. She'd sniff around, I'd enjoy the fresh air, and we'd both get a break from being indoors. At first, it was like any other place, just people going about their day, some with kids, some with pets, some just out for a walk. But after a while, I started to notice this guy. He was always there, on the same bench, right off the main path. He didn't look out of place or anything, he was just sitting there, like anyone else. But after a few days, I realized he was always watching me. Not just in that casual way, either. He was focused, like he was waiting for me to come by. I told myself it was nothing. Lots of people sit on benches, right? Maybe he was there every day for some other reason, waiting for someone or just passing time. But as the days went by, I couldn't shake the feeling. Every time I came around the corner, I'd spot him in my peripheral vision, and his head would turn, following me and Penny as we walked by. I tried not to look at him directly, tried to pretend I didn't notice. But it was hard to ignore. The worst part was how he never seemed distracted. Most people at the park had a phone, a book, something to keep them busy, but not him. He was just there, sitting straight up, watching. He didn't have a phone, didn't check the time, didn't seem to be doing anything else. Just staring. And his face never changed. He didn't smile, didn't look away, just followed us with his eyes. After a week or so, it started to make me uncomfortable enough that I decided to change my route. I figured if I took Penny down the side path that led out of the park and cut around a couple of blocks, I'd avoid his line of sight. We'd still get our walk, just without passing that spot. So, the next day, that's what I did. Penny and I went down the side path instead of the main one. We made it halfway down before I looked over my shoulder and saw him again. He was standing at the edge of the path, a little ways behind us, staring. Somehow, he'd known to move to that spot, almost as if he'd been waiting for me to take the side path. I didn't know how long he'd been there, but his eyes were locked on me again, unblinking, just watching. I felt a tightness in my chest, and I didn't know what to do. I was in a public place, the middle of the day, so I told myself I was safe. But that didn't stop my hands from shaking. I grabbed Penny's leash tighter and walked faster, taking her out of the park and straight back home. For the next couple of days, I stopped going to the park. I thought maybe I was overreacting, that it was just some coincidence, and that I was making something out of nothing. But even as I tried to ignore it, I couldn't shake the feeling of his eyes on me. After a while, I figured I'd try again, but this time at a different park, a little further away. I'd never seen him outside that one spot, so I told myself it was just that place that made me uneasy, not him. I drove Penny to the new park the next morning, feeling a little better, hoping that a new location would help me relax. The new park was nice, and I felt better almost immediately. It was a larger space with more paths and more people around, so it felt safer. Penny seemed happy too, sniffing around and pulling me forward, as if she knew it was somewhere new and exciting. But not long into our walk, I felt the familiar prickle on the back of my neck. I turned my head slowly, just glancing back, and there he was. Standing a little ways back, watching me from the edge of the path, just like before. He was close enough that I could see his face clearly, and it was the same, blank expression, the same fixed stare. My heart started racing. I hadn't told anyone where I was going, hadn't mentioned I'd be switching parks. But there he was, like he'd known exactly where I'd be. My thoughts started racing, trying to make sense of it. Maybe it was just bad luck, maybe he decided to come here too. But it didn't feel like that. He wasn't out for a walk or enjoying the park. He was just there, watching me, like he'd been waiting. I grabbed Penny's leash and started walking fast, heading straight for the exit. I didn't care if I looked scared or strange, I just wanted out. As we walked, I kept checking over my shoulder, and every time I looked back, he was still there, just close enough to be in sight. He never got closer, never made a move toward me, but he didn't leave either. Just kept his distance, watching me leave. By the time we got back to the car, I was nearly running. I got Penny in, locked the doors, and sped out of the parking lot, barely looking back. I didn't go back to the park for a week after that. I kept telling myself it was just some weird coincidence, but it didn't feel that way. It felt wrong, in a way I couldn't explain. After that, I started changing my routines. I didn't go to any park for a while. I took Penny on quick walks around the neighborhood, sticking close to home, always keeping my eyes open. But even then, I'd catch myself looking over my shoulder, half expecting to see him there, standing at the end of the street or lurking by a corner. And then, one night, I got a knock on my door. It was late, after dark, and I wasn't expecting anyone. My heart pounded as I went to look through the peephole, feeling that familiar prickle down my spine. I didn't see anyone at first, just the empty porch. But then I noticed something on the ground in front of the door, a single piece of paper. I waited, hardly daring to breathe, and watched through the peephole for a few more minutes, but no one came back. Finally, I opened the door, just enough to reach out and grab the paper, then shut it quickly behind me. I unfolded it slowly, my hands shaking. There were only 2 words written on it, in neat, tiny handwriting: I'm waiting. I didn't sleep that night. I kept all the lights on, kept Penny close by, checking every window, every door. I didn't know what he wanted, didn't understand why he was watching me, but I knew I couldn't go back to the parks. I didn't want him knowing where I lived, where I walked, where I'd be. I had no idea if he'd ever come back, or if he'd just keep watching from a distance, waiting like he'd written. It's been weeks since then. I haven't seen him again, but I still feel his eyes on me every time I leave the house. I don't go back to any of the parks. I don't go anywhere predictable. I change my routes, vary the times I go out. I don't want to give him any chances. But even now, sometimes, I catch a glimpse of someone in the corner of my eye. A figure, standing just far enough away that I can't make out the face. And every time, my heart skips, thinking it's him, that he's still out there, still watching, still waiting. I'd rented this cabin up in the mountains, way off the main road, just to get some peace and quiet. I'd been working nonstop for months, and my head felt like it was on fire, so I thought a week alone in the woods might help. It was a small place, barely big enough for one person, but it had what I needed: bed, little kitchen, bathroom, a porch out front where I could sit and breathe fresh air. The rental company assured me it was a safe area, hardly any people around, just hikers every now and then. Perfect, I thought. It was exactly what I was looking for. The first day was as normal as I could have hoped. I unloaded my bags, set up some of my stuff, and spent the day just unwinding. I made myself a meal, read a book, and went to bed early. The quiet was so thick, I thought I'd have trouble sleeping, but I was out within minutes. Woke up feeling better than I had in months. But when I opened the door that morning, there was something sitting on the porch. It was a wallet. Just sitting there, dead center in front of the door, like someone had placed it there on purpose. I picked it up, thinking maybe someone had dropped it, but then I realized there was no reason anyone should have been near the cabin. There weren't any other cabins close by. I opened the wallet, and it was full of cards, a driver's license, even a few bills. The ID was some guy I didn't know, someone named Mark. He had an address a few towns over, not anywhere close to where I was. I figured maybe he'd lost it somehow, and someone found it and left it here by mistake, thinking he was staying at the cabin. Or maybe a hiker dropped it nearby, and it got blown up here by the wind. I didn't know, but I set it on the edge of the porch, planning to bring it back with me when I went to town later. The day went by as usual. I hiked a bit, read some more, and by evening, I'd forgotten about the wallet. The second night, I slept even better. No weird dreams, no sounds, just solid sleep. But the next morning, I opened the door, and there was something else sitting there. This time, it was a set of keys. I'm talking a whole ring of them, at least a dozen, with a few keychains, one of those big plastic ones like a little kid might have, shaped like a dinosaur. And just like the wallet, they were right in the middle of the porch, almost like someone was trying to make sure I'd see them. I felt a chill that time. It didn't make any sense. I thought maybe someone was messing with me. Maybe there were people camping nearby, pulling a prank. I checked around the cabin, even walked a bit down the road, but I didn't see anyone. No cars, no tents, nothing. I took the keys and put them next to the wallet on the porch, then tried to ignore it, but it was hard to shake off the feeling that something wasn't right. That night, I kept hearing sounds. Little creaks and knocks. It's an old cabin, so I tried telling myself it was just settling noises, maybe a branch brushing against the side. But every few minutes, I'd hear it again, like someone tapping, a little too regular to be random. I barely slept, kept looking out the window, checking the lock on the door, trying to catch a glimpse of anyone nearby. But it was dark, and there was no sign of anyone around. In the morning, I opened the door, dreading what I'd find. And there it was, a cell phone. An old, beat-up one, lying there like the wallet and the keys, right in the middle of the porch. I picked it up, almost out of reflex, and it was cold. It didn't turn on, probably dead for a while. The screen was cracked, and the back had scratches all over it, like it had been dropped or scraped against something. I set it next to the wallet and keys, feeling my stomach twist. I didn't want to go out there and explore anymore. I just wanted to stay inside, where I felt at least a little safe. I thought about packing up and leaving, but I told myself it was silly, that I was overreacting. So I stayed, even though every part of me wanted to get in the car and head back to town. I tried reading again, tried to focus, but the whole day, I kept glancing at the door, listening for any sounds. It felt like something was watching me, just outside, waiting. That night, the noises came back, louder this time. I heard scratching, not like an animal but like metal on wood, like someone dragging something along the porch. I sat there in bed, wide awake, clutching my phone, waiting for it to stop. Eventually, it did, but by then, it was almost dawn, and I hadn't slept a single second. When the sun finally came up, I went to the door, heart pounding, and opened it. And there, sitting right on the middle of the porch, was a single shoe. A worn-out, muddy sneaker, like someone had been hiking in it. I didn't even touch it. Just stared at it, feeling sick to my stomach. I knew then that it wasn't a coincidence, wasn't just some lost items getting blown up by the wind. Someone was leaving them there, someone who knew I was here, and knew I'd find them. I couldn't stay any longer. I packed up my things, threw everything into my bag without even bothering to fold or organize it, and headed straight to the car. But as I got in, I noticed something that made my blood run cold. There were footsteps in the dirt, fresh ones, leading from the woods to the porch. They weren't there the day before, and they didn't belong to me. I didn't look back. I drove straight to town, heart racing, and went right to the rental office. I told them what had happened, about the items, the sounds, the footsteps. The woman at the desk looked at me like I was crazy, said no one else was renting cabins nearby, and they hadn't heard of anything strange happening up there. But I knew what I'd seen, knew it wasn't just my imagination. I handed her the wallet, the keys, and the cell phone. She took them, looking confused, and said she'd check if anyone had reported missing items, but I didn't care at that point. I just wanted to get out of there, put as much distance between me and that cabin as I could. Even now, I still think about it. About the way those things were left, just waiting for me each morning. How someone had been out there, close enough to the cabin to leave them and watch me find them. I was at the hospital waiting for my friend Sarah. She was in for a minor surgery, nothing too serious, but I promised to be there for her. It was late in the evening, and the waiting room was empty except for me. I'd been there for a while, just scrolling through my phone, trying to keep my mind off the ticking clock on the wall. That's when I noticed him. An older man, maybe in his 70s, was sitting across from me. I hadn't seen him come in. One minute I was alone, and then there he was, just sitting there, looking at me with this strange sort of focus. He wore an old gray suit, the kind people don't wear much anymore, and his face was lined, worn, like he'd seen a lot. At first, I thought maybe he was waiting for someone too, so I didn't pay him much attention. But he kept staring. After a while, I started to feel uneasy. I looked up, met his eyes, and he smiled. It wasn't a friendly smile, though. It was a knowing smile, like he recognized me, like he had a secret he wanted to share. "You look just like her," he said, his voice soft, like he was talking more to himself than to me. I gave a small, polite smile, not wanting to engage, but he didn't seem to need an invitation. "I'm sorry, do I know you?" I asked, hoping he'd say no and go back to whatever he was doing. But he leaned forward, his eyes narrowing as he studied my face. "Oh, you're her. I knew at the moment I saw you. You haven't changed a bit," he said, almost like he was accusing me. I tried to laugh it off. "I think you might have me confused with someone else," I said, hoping that would be the end of it. But he shook his head, his smile fading. No, it's you. It's really you," he said, his voice stronger this time. "After all these years, you've come back." There was something about the way he looked at me that made my skin crawl. His eyes were dark, too dark, like he was seeing something beyond me, something he wouldn't let me see. I looked around, hoping there was a nurse or someone nearby, but the waiting room was empty, and the hallway was dark. It was late, and most of the staff had gone home for the night. I thought about getting up, maybe finding somewhere else to sit, but he was blocking my way to the door. "Listen," I said, keeping my voice steady, "I really don't know you." He tilted his head, studying me, as if he was waiting for me to remember something. "Do you remember that night?" he asked, his voice barely a whisper now. "The dance, the music, the lights. You wore a blue dress. It was beautiful." My heart started racing. I had no idea what he was talking about, but the way he described it, the way he spoke to me, it felt like he was trying to pull me into some memory that didn't belong to me. "I think you've got the wrong person," I said again, more firmly this time, and I stood up, trying to keep calm as I looked for a way out. But he reached out, grabbed my wrist before I could move. His hand was cold, like he'd been standing in a freezer. "Don't leave," he said, his voice urgent now, almost pleading. "You left once. Don't leave me again." I pulled my hand back, hard, and he let go, but his eyes stayed on me, sharp, intense, filled with something I couldn't understand. I stumbled back, my heart pounding, and turned to go find a nurse, someone who could help me. As I moved toward the door, he called after me, his voice calm again, like he hadn't just grabbed me. "They won't help you," he said softly. "They never saw me then, either." I hurried out into the hallway, looking for anyone, but it was empty. The nurse's station was dark, and the halls were quiet. I spotted a single nurse down the hall and rushed over to her. "There's a man in the waiting room," I said, breathless. He keeps saying I'm someone he knows. He grabbed me." She looked at me with concern, but then she glanced past me, back toward the waiting room, and her expression changed. "There's no one there," she said, almost like she was reassuring herself. I turned to look, but the waiting room was empty. The man was gone, not a trace of him anywhere. I knew I hadn't imagined it. I could still feel the chill of his hand on my wrist, like an icy burn. He was there. Right there. "An older man in a gray suit," I insisted, but the nurse shook her head. "I've been here all night," she said, looking at me like I might be a little off. "I would have seen him." I tried to explain, to tell her how he'd spoken to me, how he seemed so certain I was someone he knew, but she just patted my arm and told me to take a seat, that maybe I was just tired from waiting. But as I walked back to the waiting room, my head was spinning. The man was gone, but I still felt his eyes on me, like he was there, somewhere, watching. I sat down, trying to calm myself, but the seat across from me felt like it still held his presence, as if he'd only just left. I wrapped my arms around myself, feeling colder than I should have, and checked my phone, willing time to pass faster, wanting Sarah to be done so I could leave. About an hour later, Sarah's doctor came out to tell me she was fine and recovering, and I nearly ran to her room, just to get away from that waiting area. She was groggy but awake, and I tried to play it off, telling her I just had a weird wait. But she noticed I was shaking and asked if everything was okay. "Just some guy," I said, trying to laugh it off, but my voice cracked. He thought I was someone else. Kept calling me by some other name, talking about things that never happened. Sarah looked at me, her eyes narrowing. "Was he old?" "Gray suit?" she asked, her voice quiet. My heart dropped. "Yeah." "How?" Her face went pale. "I saw him, too. I thought he was a janitor or something, just standing in the hall outside my room. He was looking at me, staring like he knew me. I tried to say hi, but he just kept staring, like he was waiting for me to remember him. I felt my skin go cold. She was in a different part of the hospital, nowhere near the waiting room, yet she'd seen him, too. He'd been watching both of us. I told her about everything, the things he said, how he grabbed my wrist, how the nurse didn't see him. She didn't say anything, just listened, her face getting paler with every word. The next day, Sarah was discharged, and we left the hospital as fast as we could. I didn't look back, didn't want to see that empty waiting room, didn't want to know if he'd be there, sitting on that chair, waiting for me to come back. It's been weeks, and I haven't gone back to that hospital, haven't talked to anyone about it since. But sometimes, I still feel his eyes on me, like he's waiting, somewhere just out of sight, thinking I'll remember him. I was driving home late, a little after midnight. I'd taken a back road, one of those two-lane stretches that cuts through miles of empty fields and dark woods. I'd driven it before, and it's always quiet out there, barely a car in sight, but I like that. No traffic, no lights, just open road. That night, though, something felt different. It was too quiet, like the air was pressing down on everything. I'd been driving for a while when I saw a car pulled over on the shoulder up ahead, hazards flashing. It was an old, beat-up sedan, silver or maybe gray, hard to tell in the dark. I slowed down and looked around. No one else was out there, just me and that car, surrounded by nothing but trees and empty fields. The road was straight for a long way, and there wasn't a house or building in sight. I'm not the kind of guy to just drive past someone who looks stranded, so I slowed down and pulled over a little ahead of him. I figured I'd see if he needed a jump or something. As I parked, I glanced in my rearview mirror and saw the driver still sitting in his car, staring straight ahead, not looking at me. I got out, leaving my car running with the headlights on, and started to walk back toward him. As I got closer, I noticed something strange. He hadn't turned his head at all. His hands were on the wheel, gripping it tight, and his face was stiff, almost like he was frozen in place. I got to his window and tapped on it, trying to get his attention. He didn't react. I leaned down and looked through the glass, waving my hand a bit, but he didn't move. He just kept staring straight ahead. I felt a little uneasy, but I thought maybe he was in shock or just really shaken up. "Hey, you okay?" I asked, raising my voice a bit so he could hear me through the glass. Nothing. Just that stare. I could see his face clearer now, and there was something off about it. His eyes were wide open, but they looked empty, glazed over. His mouth was slightly open, and he was breathing, but shallowly, like he was barely there. I knocked on the window again, harder this time, and tried the door handle. Locked. That's when he moved, just slightly, and looked at me through the rearview mirror. His eyes met mine, and he still didn't turn his head, just looked at me in the mirror with that blank expression. I raised my hands, trying to show I was just there to help, but he didn't respond. His gaze stayed locked on me, unblinking, like he was looking through me. A weird feeling crept over me, and I took a step back. I figured maybe he was drunk or on something, so I went back to my car to get my phone, thinking I'd call someone to come check on him. But when I opened my car door, I heard a loud click from behind me. I turned around, and he was still sitting there, staring at me, but he just locked his doors again, even though I hadn't tried to open them. I got into my car, and I could feel my heart pounding. Something about the whole thing felt wrong, like I'd interrupted something that wasn't meant for me to see. I tried to shake it off, telling myself it was just a guy who didn't want help, maybe didn't trust a stranger out here at night. But as I started to put my car in drive, I saw him still watching me in his mirror, his head slightly tilted, his face still that same blank, empty stare. I took a deep breath and tried to get my mind back on the road, but then I saw his headlights turn off. He was still there, in the dark now, and all I could see was his silhouette in the driver's seat, still facing straight ahead. Something in my gut told me to just leave, but I sat there for a moment, watching him. I wanted to understand what was going on, wanted some kind of explanation for this weird feeling that was making the hair on my neck stand up. Just then, I saw movement. He'd shifted, ever so slightly, his head turning a bit toward me, like he was trying to get a better look. I couldn't see his eyes anymore, but I knew he was still watching me. I put my car into gear, ready to just get out of there, but before I could pull away, he turned his headlights on, flooding the inside of my car with light. I froze. He'd gone from ignoring me to watching me to practically blinding me with his headlights. It was like he was playing some kind of game, and I didn't understand the rules. My hands gripped the wheel, and I could feel sweat starting to bead on my forehead. I looked in my rearview mirror, and he was still there, lights blazing, face turned directly toward me now, his expression hidden in the bright glow. I thought about just speeding off, but then I saw his car move. He'd shifted into gear, too, and now he was creeping forward, inching closer to my car. I didn't know what he wanted, didn't understand why he was doing this, but every instinct I had was telling me to get out of there. So I did. I floored it, watching his lights fade in the mirror as I put as much distance between us as I could. After a mile or so, I started to calm down, started to feel a bit silly for freaking out. It was probably just some weirdo trying to scare me, I thought. But then I saw headlights again, coming up fast. I looked in the mirror, and it was him, his car speeding up behind me, lights flashing. My heart sank. He wasn't done. He was following me. I pressed down on the gas, pushing my car faster than I usually would on that winding road. The trees blurred past, and my focus narrowed to the road in front of me, the sharp curves and sudden drops. His lights kept up with me, close enough that I could see his car gaining on me, close enough that he could hit my bumper if he wanted to. I thought about pulling off to the side, but I didn't want to stop, didn't want to give him a chance to get any closer. I kept driving, my hands tight on the wheel, my eyes fixed on the road. I couldn't shake the feeling that he was just waiting for me to make a mistake, to slip up. I don't know how long I kept driving like that, but after a while, his headlights started to fall back. I dared a quick glance in the mirror and saw him slowing down, finally disappearing around a bend behind me. I didn't stop. I kept going until I reached the main road, and even then, I didn't feel safe. I kept expecting to see his car in my mirror again, his headlights coming up fast, but he didn't follow me out to the highway. When I got home, I couldn't sleep. I kept seeing his face in my mind, that blank stare, the way he looked at me in the rearview mirror like he knew something I didn't. I don't know who he was or what he wanted, and part of me doesn't want to know. But sometimes, when I'm driving alone at night, I still check my mirror, half expecting to see those headlights again, creeping up behind me, with that face staring back. I just finished up a late-night grocery run. I don't usually go out that late, but I had a lot on my plate that day, and it was close to midnight before I made it to the store. The parking lot was practically empty, and the overhead lights gave everything a washed-out, eerie look. But I was just focused on getting home, so I grabbed my bags, tossed them into the trunk, and started looking for my car keys to lock the doors. I patted my pockets, reached into my purse, nothing. I figured I must have dropped them somewhere between the checkout and the car. I walked back toward the store entrance, retracing my steps, eyes glued to the ground. It was so quiet that even my footsteps seemed too loud. That's when I noticed a man standing by the door. He looked about my age, maybe a bit older, and had this scruffy look, like he'd been up too long. I only glanced at him, but I could tell he was watching me. He looked like he was waiting for someone, so I tried to ignore him and kept scanning the ground for my keys. He must have noticed I was searching for something because he started walking toward me, calling out, "Lose something?" I didn't really want to answer him, but I figured he was just being friendly, so I said, "Yeah, I think I dropped my keys." He nodded like he understood, then, without me asking, he started looking around too. The more I thought about it, the stranger it seemed. Most people don't just step in to help like that, especially not at midnight in an empty parking lot. I tried to stay calm, reminding myself that he could have just been trying to be nice, but something about him was off. I kept my distance, pretending to look around a different part of the lot, but he was moving closer to me, still scanning the ground. After a couple of minutes, he called out, "Hey, you said you lost your keys, right?" I looked over, and he was standing right next to my car. I hadn't told him which one was mine, and there were other cars in the lot, but he went right to it. My skin crawled, and I felt this tightness in my chest. "Yeah," I said, trying to sound casual. "Did you find them?" He paused for a moment, just looking at me with this strange smile. "I didn't, but I'm sure they're around here somewhere." He was leaning against my car door now, still watching me, like he was waiting for something. I didn't know what to say. I forced a little laugh and said, "Maybe they're back inside. I'll go check." I started walking toward the entrance, hoping he'd just leave me alone. But as I walked, I could feel his eyes on me, and then I heard his footsteps following behind. He was keeping pace with me, just a few steps back. I couldn't believe it. He had no reason to be going back to the store. He'd just been loitering outside, and now he was following me in. I didn't know what to do, but I knew I didn't want him any closer. I picked up my pace, and he did too. By the time I reached the entrance, he was right behind me, his footsteps heavy and fast. The automatic doors opened, and I rushed inside, heading straight for the front desk where the customer service person was sitting. I told her I'd lost my keys, loud enough so he could hear. He lingered just inside the doors, watching me while I talked to her. She told me to wait while she checked with the manager, and I noticed him start walking toward the aisles, acting like he was just browsing. But every now and then, he'd glance over at me, still with that strange look on his face. The girl at the counter came back after a few minutes, saying they hadn't found any keys. I thanked her, my stomach sinking. I didn't know what to do next. I couldn't just stay in the store all night, but I didn't want to go back outside with him hanging around either. I decided to stall for a bit, browsing the aisles, hoping he'd give up and leave. I kept an eye on him from a distance, but he never strayed too far, always glancing over at me, always watching. I started to feel trapped, like there was no way out of this without facing him again. Finally, after what felt like forever, he walked up to the counter and asked the girl if he could buy a pack of gum. He handed her a few coins, acting like he was just some normal guy, and then he headed back outside. I waited until I saw him step out of view before I went up to the counter again. "Did you notice that guy?" I asked the girl. He was following me around the parking lot. She looked concerned but said she hadn't noticed anything unusual. I felt helpless. It was just me and her, and I didn't want to wait around forever hoping he'd leave. I finally worked up the courage to go back out. I made my way to the parking lot, clutching my purse, ready to make a run for it if I had to. As I stepped outside, I looked around, but I didn't see him. The lot was empty again, just the eerie lights and my car a little ways off. I walked toward it, glancing over my shoulder, trying to stay aware. When I got to my car, I stopped. My keys were lying right on the hood, like someone had placed them there. I felt this rush of relief, but also fear. He must have put them there. How else would they have ended up right in plain sight? I snatched them up, unlocked my car, and climbed in, locking the doors behind me. I was about to start the engine when I looked up and saw him standing at the edge of the lot, watching me. He hadn't left. He'd just been waiting, hiding in the shadows. I started my car and backed out, my hands shaking. I kept my eyes on him, and he just stood there, staring, that same unsettling smile on his face. I don't know what he wanted, don't know why he went out of his way to help only to creep me out like that, but I didn't want to stick around to find out. As I pulled out of the lot, I watched him in the rearview mirror until he disappeared into the darkness. The whole drive home, I kept looking over my shoulder, half expecting to see him following me again. I brought my car into this little repair shop off the highway. It was one of those places that didn't look like much from the outside, all beat up and run down, but it was the closest option, and I'd been hearing weird sounds coming from my engine for a couple of days. Figured it was safer to just get it checked out before it got worse. The place was almost empty, and the only people around were a couple of mechanics sitting in the corner, leaning back in their chairs, talking low. I couldn't catch much of what they were saying, but I got the feeling it wasn't exactly car-related. Still, when I walked in, they both stopped talking and looked at me like they'd just been caught doing something. One of them got up and walked over, wiping his hands on a greasy rag. He was older, with a thick mustache and tired eyes, looking like he'd been working there all his life. The other guy was younger, in his 20s maybe, with a shaved head and a nervous look, like he didn't want to be there any more than I did. I told them about the noise my car was making, a kind of rattling sound under the hood. The older guy nodded, looking at me with this strange expression that I couldn't quite read. "You came to the right place," he said, then glanced over at the younger guy with a slight smirk. It felt odd, like there was something else in that look, something I wasn't in on. They took my keys and told me to have a seat in the waiting area. The older one walked out to check my car, and I watched him through the glass door as he popped the hood, leaning over with his head down, talking to himself or maybe just muttering about the engine. But then I noticed the younger one wasn't with him. He'd stayed inside, standing a little ways from me, watching me, like he was trying to figure something out. I asked him if something was wrong, and he blinked like he hadn't expected me to talk to him. He shook his head, looking away. "Nah, it's nothing," he said, but his voice sounded tense, almost too casual, like he was trying hard to act normal. I sat down, keeping an eye on him, and that's when I heard them talking again. The older guy was back now, and the two of them were just out of earshot, but I caught bits and pieces of it. They were talking about my car, but it was in this way that felt wrong. I heard the younger guy say something like, "You sure he's the right one?" And the older guy muttered back, "Yeah, he is. Look at him. He's in the right place." It made my stomach drop. I didn't know what they meant by that, but I felt this chill go up my spine. I stood up and asked them if they needed anything else, trying to play it off, but the older guy just glanced at me with this blank stare, like he hadn't expected me to overhear. "What are you talking about?" I asked, keeping my voice steady. They just looked at each other, and then the older guy gave me this easy smile. "Nothing, just the car. We'll have it fixed up in no time. You should sit back down, though, and relax. It'll take a while." There was something in the way he said it that made me feel trapped. I was in a small shop, barely any people around, and it was getting late. My gut told me to leave, to just grab my keys and drive off, but then I thought about my car. I didn't know what was wrong with it, and I didn't want to risk breaking down somewhere even worse. I tried to keep calm, sitting back down, but my mind was racing. I kept an eye on them, watching as they went back to my car, talking low again. Every now and then, they'd glance back toward the shop, just enough for me to notice. It felt like they were sizing me up, like they were making some kind of plan. About 15 minutes passed, and the younger guy came back in, saying he needed my license and insurance information. I didn't see why he'd need it just to check on a rattling sound, but I handed it over anyway, trying not to show any hesitation. He didn't say a word after that, just took my info and disappeared into a back room. I couldn't sit still anymore. I walked outside, hoping the fresh air would help clear my head, but when I stepped out, The older guy was standing by my car, looking down at the open engine. His face was calm, almost too calm, and he barely acknowledged me, just nodding as if to say he was still working. I tried to keep it light, asked him if he'd found the problem yet, and he finally looked at me, but his eyes were cold, distant. "Takes time," he said, his voice flat. "Might be more complicated than we thought." I was about to tell him I'd take my car somewhere else when I noticed something odd. My car hood was closed now, and he was leaning on it, like he was trying to keep me from looking inside. I couldn't shake the feeling that he was hiding something, that whatever he'd been doing to my car had nothing to do with fixing it. I told him I'd take the car as is, that I'd changed my mind, but he didn't move. Just crossed his arms, blocking me from getting close. "Already started," he said, his voice low. "Wouldn't be safe to drive it like this now." My heart was pounding, and I didn't know what to do. I turned to head back inside, planning to call someone, anyone, just to have someone know where I was. But as I reached for my phone, the younger guy stepped out of the back room, holding my license and insurance, and he stopped right in front of me, blocking the door. He was smiling, that same odd smile the older guy had, and it hit me just how alone I was, how far I was from anything else. I could feel my pulse hammering in my chest as I tried to keep my voice calm. "Look," I said, trying to keep the panic out of my voice, "I just want my car back. I don't need it fixed." The older guy moved closer, resting his hand on my car's hood. "You're in the right place," he said again, like that meant something. The younger one just stared at me, waiting for my reaction. I didn't wait. I darted around them, heading toward the main road, hoping a car would pass by, someone who might stop. They didn't follow me, but I could feel their eyes on my back. I walked until I was far enough that they were just two dark figures by the car. I kept moving, not stopping until I saw headlights coming from down the road. I waved down the driver, explaining as quickly as I could that I needed help. He let me use his phone to call for a tow, and I watched from a distance as the two men stood by my car, watching me until the tow truck showed up. When the driver got there, they tried to say it was fine, that they were almost done with the repairs, but I refused to listen. I climbed into the tow truck, and we pulled out of there, leaving my car in the shop. It didn't matter. I'd get it back some other way. I spent a lot of time at the library. It was one of those places where I could focus on my studies, away from distractions at home. I liked the quiet, the smell of old books, and the feeling of being surrounded by knowledge. One night, I decided to stay late to prepare for my upcoming exams. The library was almost empty, the usual buzz of students diminished to just a few whispers and the sound of pages turning. I found a corner table near the back, away from the main pathways. It felt safe, almost like my own little fortress. I spread my notes out, opened my laptop, and lost myself in the work. As I typed, I noticed a man sitting a few tables away. At first, I didn't think much of it. He was just another student, maybe studying late like me. He had dark hair, and his features were unremarkable. He seemed absorbed in his book, but every so often, I caught him glancing in my direction. At first, I dismissed it. People glance around all the time. Maybe he was looking at his phone or just lost in thought. But as time passed, I felt his gaze linger longer than it should. I tried to focus on my notes, but it was hard to shake the feeling that he was watching me. A few minutes later, I glanced up again. He had moved to a table closer to mine. Not directly next to me, but definitely within my line of sight. I felt my heart start to race. I told myself I was being paranoid. It was a public library after all, and I was just a student trying to study. I went back to my laptop, but it was hard to concentrate. I kept catching glimpses of him. He had this strange stillness about him. He was not reading anymore. He just sat there, staring in my direction, the corners of his mouth slightly turned up as if he was amused by something. I shivered but tried to shake it off. After a while, I decided I needed a break. I stood up, stretching my legs, and walked to the restroom. On the way, I kept an eye on him. He remained at his table, but his gaze followed me as I walked past. The feeling of being watched crawled up my spine. When I returned, he was at another table, closer again. I forced myself to sit down and focus. I tried to convince myself that he was just another student. But as I returned to my work, my thoughts drifted back to him. I glanced up once more. He was not reading, he was staring at me again, that same eerie smile on his face. Time dragged on, and I could feel the tension in my shoulders. I made an excuse to get up again, telling myself I needed more coffee to stay awake. I walked to the front desk and grabbed a cup. As I poured the coffee, I glanced back toward my table. To my surprise, the man was at the table right next to mine now. I could see him more clearly. He looked ordinary, but there was something unsettling about him. The way he watched me felt predatory, like I was the only thing he was interested in. I told myself I was being irrational. There were plenty of people in the library, after all. I settled back at my table, my heart racing. I started to pack my things, hoping to distract myself from his presence. My laptop, my notes, my coffee cup. I was almost done when I looked up one last time. He was gone. I blinked, my mind racing. How could he have left so quickly? I had just seen him there, only a moment ago. I felt an odd mix of relief and unease. I hurried to gather my things, glancing around the library, half expecting him to be lurking nearby, but there was no sign of him. The other students were still there, focused on their studies, unaware of the tension I had felt. I stood up, clutching my bag tightly, and decided it was time to leave. I hurried toward the exit, my heart pounding in my chest. The air felt heavy, as if I was being watched again, but I refused to look back. I pushed open the heavy door and stepped out into the night, the cool air washing over me like a relief. As I walked to my car, I kept checking over my shoulder, half expecting him to appear again. My breath came out in quick bursts, and I fumbled for my keys. Once inside the car, I locked the doors and took a moment to breathe. The library felt like a lifetime away. I drove home, my mind racing with thoughts of that man. I tried to convince myself it was nothing, that I was just imagining things. But deep down, I knew that feeling would stick with me for a long time. I never returned to that library alone at night again. It was one of those perfect summer days when everything felt alive. I was at the annual street festival, a massive event filled with music, food stalls, and colorful lights. People bustled everywhere, laughter and chatter filling the air. I remember feeling lighthearted, enjoying the sights and sounds, as well as the vibrant atmosphere. I wandered through the crowd, sampling different foods, trying some spicy tacos and a funnel cake that was far too sweet but absolutely delicious. The festival was a blast, and I was glad I had decided to come. After a while, I noticed a man standing a few feet away. He was holding a camera, pointing it in my direction. I thought maybe he was a professional photographer capturing the festival. I waved, thinking nothing of it, but he didn't wave back. I brushed it off and continued to enjoy myself. I moved toward a group of musicians playing lively tunes, clapping along with the crowd. The music was infectious, and I lost myself in it, laughing with strangers, dancing a bit. But then I felt a strange sensation, like someone was watching me. I glanced back, and there was the same man, still standing there, still pointing the camera at me. He was not close, but he seemed to be adjusting his position to keep me in frame. It made me uncomfortable, but I told myself he was just capturing the festival. I turned away again, trying to shake off the unease. I walked deeper into the crowd, but after a few moments, I caught a glimpse of him again. He had moved again, still keeping a distance, but always in line with me. This time, I could feel my heart rate quickening. I didn't know what to think. I made my way toward a nearby food stand, hoping to lose him in the crowd. I ordered a lemonade, taking a moment to collect myself, but I could still see him through the throng of people. He had shifted to another spot but was still keeping an eye on me. It felt like he was intentionally tracking my movements. Feeling a mix of annoyance and fear, I decided to leave the stand and head toward a busier area, hoping the crowd would dissuade him. I walked past a group of children playing with balloons and noticed a couple dancing to a nearby band. I watched them for a moment, and when I turned to continue walking, there he was again. He had somehow maneuvered himself even closer. I could see the focus in his eyes, and it felt like he was waiting for something. I started to feel a heavy dread settling in my stomach. Why was he following me? Was he some kind of creep? I looked around, trying to find someone to talk to, anyone to help break the tension. I decided to leave the main festival area and headed toward a quieter section of the park. I figured that if I could just get some space, maybe I could shake him off. I took a long route, weaving through food stalls, and for a moment, I thought I was in the clear. I found a little alcove with benches and decided to sit down for a minute. But just as I got comfortable, I looked up and saw him again, standing at the edge of the shadows. He had a strange smile on his face as he continued to aim his camera at me. I felt a wave of panic wash over me. This was not just harmless photography, something was off about him. I stood up abruptly and walked away, my heart pounding. I could hear the distant sounds of music and laughter fading as I moved further away from the festival. I glanced back, and he was still there, his gaze fixed on me, never lowering the camera. I knew I had to confront him. I walked back toward the crowd, adrenaline rushing through me. I approached him directly and demanded to know what he wanted. He looked taken aback, as if I had interrupted his focus. "Why are you following me?" I asked, my voice shaking. He just smiled, still holding the camera, and finally spoke. "You have an interesting face." I felt a chill run down my spine. What did that mean? Was he just some oddball with a camera? I could feel anger rising, mixed with fear. I asked him again, "What do you want?" He hesitated, then shrugged. "Just taking pictures. I like people." I shook my head, backing away slowly. "This is not okay. You need to stop." He frowned slightly, lowering his camera for the first time, but he didn't move away. It was like he was gauging my reaction, waiting for me to turn my back. I felt trapped. I turned and headed back into the crowd, forcing myself to push through the throng of people, not daring to look back. I tried to keep moving, my heart racing, weaving through festival goers until I finally found a group of friends I recognized. They were laughing, oblivious to my distress. I joined them, forcing a smile on my face as I mingled, trying to appear calm. My friends surrounded me, and I felt safer, but I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. I kept scanning the crowd, half expecting to see him lurking in the background, but I didn't. After a while, I began to relax, enjoying the festivities once more. I stayed with my friends until the sun began to set, and the festival started winding down. As I walked to my car with my friends, I felt relieved. I had made it through the night without incident. I couldn't stop thinking about that man and what his intentions were. I never saw him again, and I hoped I wouldn't. The festival was supposed to be a joyful experience, but it had turned into something sinister. Once I got into my car, I locked the doors, took a deep breath, and drove away, leaving that strange encounter behind. I had just started my second year of college, and everything seemed to be going well. I was excited about my classes and felt optimistic about the new semester. One class, in particular, was a large lecture that took place in a big hall with tiered seating. The professor was engaging, and the subject matter fascinated me, so I was eager to attend every session. As the weeks went by, I began to notice something strange. Each time I left the lecture hall, I would return to find my belongings rearranged. At first, I thought I was just being forgetful. Maybe I left my notes in a different spot or shifted my backpack without realizing it. But then it started to feel too odd to dismiss. I would leave my laptop open on my desk while I went to get a drink of water or use the restroom, and every time I came back, my notes would be in a different order, or my bag would be slightly unzipped. I brushed it off, thinking I might have a case of paranoia. After all, it was a crowded lecture hall, and it was entirely possible someone else had accidentally bumped into my belongings. But as it continued, I felt the unease creeping in. One day, I decided to take a closer look. I stayed in my seat until almost everyone had left the hall. When I gathered my things, I realized my laptop was open, and the screen had a note on it. Nice notes, it read. It sent chills through me. I looked around to see if anyone was watching. The room was empty, and the only sound was the echo of my footsteps as I hurried out. I was too unsettled to focus on my studies that night. I kept thinking about the note and the feeling of being watched. The next day, I decided to take action. I set up my laptop to record video while I left the room. I wanted to see if I could catch whoever was messing with my things. After setting up the camera, I left the hall once again, doing my best to appear casual. I went to grab lunch and sat in the dining hall, trying to distract myself from the anxiety. I spent the whole time fiddling with my phone, checking the time over and over. After what felt like an eternity, I returned to the lecture hall, heart pounding. I pulled my laptop out and started the video. My fingers trembled slightly as I pressed play. The first few minutes showed nothing. The room was empty, just as I had left it. Then, just when I thought I was going to be disappointed, a figure slipped through the doorway. It was a student I vaguely recognized from my class. He often sat near the back and rarely spoke. He approached my desk, glancing around as if making sure no one was watching. My heart sank as I watched him lean down to examine my bag. He unzipped it slowly, carefully looking inside. I felt a knot in my stomach. What was he doing? Was he looking for something specific? He pulled out my notebook, flipping through the pages before putting it back. Then he turned his attention to my laptop, and I held my breath. I could see the glint of something shiny in his hand. He pulled out a small notepad and began writing something. He seemed to take his time, writing deliberately. I felt sick with worry, wondering what he could possibly be scribbling down. He finished writing and placed the note on the keyboard, making sure it was visible. After that, he glanced around again before slipping out of the room. I quickly paused the video, my hand shaking as I replayed the moment. I needed to see the note. I didn't want to face the potential implications, but I had to know. I clicked on the video again, my heart racing as I watched him leave. I took a deep breath and leaned closer to my laptop, finally ready to see what he had written. My stomach dropped as I saw the note. Why do you keep your things here? You should be careful. I stared at the screen, my mind racing. What did he mean by that? My instinct was to panic. I felt exposed and vulnerable, like I was being stalked without any control over the situation. I immediately closed my laptop and left the hall, determination rising within me. I decided to report the incident to campus security. I showed them the video and the note. The officers listened carefully, taking notes and asking questions. They assured me they would look into it. I felt a flicker of hope as they promised to investigate the matter. For the next few days, I stayed on high alert. I didn't leave my belongings unattended, and I avoided the lecture hall whenever possible. I focused on my classes but found it hard to concentrate. The unease sat heavy on my shoulders, and I constantly scanned the room for him. It felt like I was in a suspenseful thriller, waiting for the next moment of tension to unfold. Eventually, a couple of days later, I received a call from campus security. They informed me that they had spoken to the student and he had admitted to going through my things. They assured me he would be facing disciplinary action. I felt a wave of relief wash over me, but also a lingering fear. It was unsettling to think that he had been so close to me for so long, watching me without my knowledge. In the following weeks, I changed my routine. I started sitting closer to the front of the class, avoiding the back rows where he usually sat. I kept my belongings close and remained vigilant. It took time, but eventually, I began to feel safe again. Although I never saw him again, the memory lingered. I learned a lesson about trust and awareness, and while I eventually returned to my routine, I always remained cautious. I knew that sometimes, things are not as they seem, and it is important to listen to your instincts. I remember that night clearly. I had been driving for hours, the headlights of my car cutting through the darkness on a stretch of road that felt endless. I needed to refuel, and the gas station I pulled into was small and dimly lit, a typical rural stop that seemed almost forgotten. It was late, the kind of late where the world feels empty, and the shadows stretch longer than usual. I parked my car at the pump, stepped out, and felt the cool air wrap around me. The station was quiet except for the hum of the fluorescent lights overhead. I walked toward the entrance, my footsteps echoing against the pavement. As I pushed open the door, a little bell jingled, but it felt more like a warning than a welcome. The cashier was an older man, perhaps in his 60s. He stood behind the counter, his gaze fixed on me. He didn't look away, didn't even blink. The light from the overhead lamps made his skin look pale, almost waxy, and his eyes seemed unnaturally wide, like he was trying to absorb every detail of my presence. I felt a strange shiver run down my spine. "Just gas," I said, trying to break the silence. His stare didn't waver. It made me uncomfortable, like I was being scrutinized in a way I couldn't understand. I went to the cooler and grabbed a bottle of water, keeping my eyes on him as I moved. He still didn't speak. Just watched. I paid for the gas and the water. The transaction was quick, but it felt like it lasted much longer. As I stepped outside, the bell jingled again behind me, and I glanced back. The cashier remained behind the counter, his eyes locked onto me, his expression unreadable. I shrugged it off, thinking I was just tired and overly sensitive. I walked to the pump, unscrewed the gas cap, and started filling my tank. The quiet of the night was punctuated only by the soft click of the pump. I tried to focus on the task at hand, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. After a moment, I glanced up. My heart sank as I realized the cashier was now sitting in a car parked a few spaces away. It was an old sedan, the kind that looked like it had seen better days. The lights were off, but the car was facing my direction, and he was staring right at me through the windshield. I froze for a second. The look in his eyes was intense, almost predatory. I felt my breath hitch in my throat. I quickly turned back to the gas pump, trying to keep my composure, but my heart was racing. What was he doing out there? Why was he watching me? I finished pumping the gas, but my hands felt shaky as I put the nozzle back in place. I debated whether I should just get back in my car and drive away or confront him. The last thing I wanted was to provoke someone who seemed so fixated on me, but the thought of just leaving without knowing felt equally unsettling. As I made my decision to get in my car, I heard the sound of the driver's door opening. I spun around, my heart pounding in my chest. The cashier was stepping out of his car, still watching me. There was something deeply unsettling about his calm demeanor, like he was moving in slow motion while my heart raced. He walked slowly toward me, his hands shoved deep in his pockets, and I could feel panic rising in me. I was half ready to jump into my car and lock the doors, but I didn't want to appear cowardly. I forced myself to take a step forward. "Is there a problem?" I called out, trying to keep my voice steady. I was met with silence as he continued to approach, not saying a word. My instinct screamed at me to get away, but I stood my ground. I could feel the tension in the air, thick and heavy. He stopped a few feet away, his gaze still locked on me. "You shouldn't be here at this hour," he finally said, his voice low and steady. The way he spoke felt loaded, as if he knew something I didn't. "It's not safe." My throat went dry. "I'm just filling up my tank. I'm about to leave." He nodded slowly, but his expression did not change. "You don't understand. You need to go." The urgency in his tone made my stomach drop. I looked around, half expecting someone else to appear, but the gas station remained desolate. "Why?" I asked, feeling more than a little foolish for engaging with him. "What do you mean?" He took a step closer, lowering his voice as if sharing a secret. "People don't stop here for a reason. You don't belong here. You should go." I felt a rush of adrenaline surge through me. There was something deeply wrong about the entire situation. "I'm leaving," I said, backing up toward my car, hands instinctively reaching for my keys in my pocket. He suddenly raised a finger, pointing toward the road. "You need to leave now. Don't stop." His intensity was enough to push me into action. I turned and ran to my car, fumbling with the keys as I unlocked the door. I slid into the driver's seat, slamming the door shut and locking it. My heart raced as I glanced in the rearview mirror. The cashier stood where I had left him, still staring but now with a sense of urgency in his posture. I started the engine, my hands trembling as I put the car in gear. I didn't look back as I pulled away, the gas station fading into the darkness behind me. I drove fast, my heart pounding in my ears, the road ahead feeling both familiar and foreign. Eventually, I reached the main road, the lights of the town shining brightly in the distance. Relief washed over me, but I couldn't shake the feeling of unease that settled in my stomach. I glanced in the mirror again, half expecting to see the old sedan following me, but there was nothing behind me. Once I reached the safety of the town, I felt my tension slowly ease. The brightness of the lights and the familiarity of the streets calmed my nerves. I promised myself I would never stop at that gas station again, no matter how desperate I was. I took a long-distance train to visit my sister. It was early morning when I boarded, and I settled into my window seat, thankful for a chance to relax. The rhythmic clattering of the train wheels against the tracks felt soothing, and I was looking forward to the quiet journey. I glanced around the carriage. It was mostly empty, with just a few other passengers scattered about. As the train pulled away from the station, I opened my book, hoping to get lost in the story for a while. I had just started to read when a man entered the carriage. He was middle-aged, with a scruffy beard and unkempt hair. He wore a heavy jacket that looked out of place for the weather. I noticed he paused, scanning the seats before choosing the one directly across from me. I felt a slight unease as he settled in, but I tried to ignore it, thinking he just wanted to sit. I returned to my book, but it was hard to focus. The man stared at me, and I could feel his eyes boring into me. It was unsettling. After a moment, he broke the silence. "Is this your stop?" he asked. I looked up, a bit startled. "No, I am just passing through." He nodded, but the intensity of his gaze remained. I tried to return to my reading, but he continued to stare. Then, he leaned forward slightly, his voice dropping to a near whisper. "You know, not everyone makes it home." I felt my stomach twist. "What do you mean?" He smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. "I mean, if something were to happen, would anyone miss you?" I forced a laugh, not knowing how else to respond. "Of course. My family will be waiting for me." He tilted his head, as if considering my answer. "Are you sure?" Sometimes people think they are missed, but in reality, they are just forgotten. I felt a chill creep up my spine. This was not a normal conversation. I looked around the carriage again, but no one else was close enough to hear us. I considered moving to another seat, but I hesitated. Something about that seemed cowardly, and I did not want to show him any fear. "Why would you say that?" I asked, trying to keep my tone even. He shrugged. "Just a thought. You never know what might happen on a journey like this." I glanced at my watch. The trip was only going to take a few hours. Surely, he would tire of this conversation soon. I attempted to focus on my book, hoping to drown out his presence. I managed to read a few paragraphs, but his gaze was a constant weight on my shoulders. After a few moments of silence, he spoke again. "What if you didn't make it home? What would happen then?" I took a deep breath, feeling my heart begin to race. "I would just take the next train back." He laughed, a hollow sound that echoed in the empty carriage. "But what if it was too late? What if you never made it home?" The train began to slow as we approached a station. I felt a momentary rush of relief, thinking about how I could simply get off and distance myself from this man. As the train came to a halt, I prepared to stand up. "Leaving already?" he asked, his tone almost mocking. "Don't you want to see how this story plays out?" "Excuse me," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. I gathered my belongings and stood up. I didn't look back as I made my way to the door, but I could feel his eyes following me. I stepped off the train, the fresh air hitting me like a wave. I took a moment to steady myself, scanning the platform for a place to sit and gather my thoughts. There were a few people milling about, but I felt an overwhelming urge to distance myself from that man. As I stood there, I heard the train doors close behind me. I turned just in time to see him watching me from the window of the train, a smile spreading across his face. The train started to pull away, and I quickly moved away from the platform, heart pounding. I found a bench in a quieter area of the station and sat down, trying to collect myself. I texted my sister, letting her know I had arrived safely and that I would meet her soon. I watched the train disappear into the distance, the sense of unease still lingering in the air. I knew I had made the right decision to leave that train. I kept my eyes on my phone, glancing up occasionally, half expecting to see that man appear again. I didn't want to dwell on what he had said, but his words echoed in my mind. "Would anyone miss you?" I shook my head, trying to rid myself of the thoughts. I took deep breaths, focusing on the people around me, the normalcy of the situation. I waited for my sister to arrive, and as the minutes passed, I felt my anxiety slowly fade. When she finally walked in, I jumped up to greet her, relief washing over me. I hugged her tightly, grateful to be with someone I loved. As we walked out of the station together, I glanced back one last time at the platform. I did not see the man again. The experience stayed with me, a chilling reminder of how quickly things can turn strange. I felt fortunate that I had chosen to leave, but I also knew there was something deeply unsettling about what had just happened. I didn't understand it, but I knew I would be more cautious in the future. Sometimes, it is better to trust your instincts and to recognize that not everyone has good intentions. I decided to visit a small-town farmer's market one sunny Saturday. I had heard good things about it, how the locals made the best homemade goods and how friendly everyone was. The drive there was pleasant, the road lined with tall trees and fields bursting with color. When I arrived, the market was bustling with life. Stalls filled with fresh produce, flowers, and handmade crafts greeted me. I could smell the sweet scent of baked goods drifting through the air. As I wandered through the rows of tables, I came across a vendor selling pies. The woman behind the table, an older lady with silver hair and bright blue eyes, had a warm smile. "Would you like to try a slice?" she asked, her voice cheerful. I nodded and accepted a small piece. It was delicious, sweet and rich with flavors I couldn't quite place. I decided to buy a whole pie. The lady wrapped it up for me and thanked me as I handed her the cash. "Make sure you enjoy it," she said, a glint in her eye that made me pause for just a moment, but I shook it off. Maybe it was just my imagination. I thanked her again and walked away, pie in hand, feeling pleased with my purchase. As I found a bench near the market, I sat down to enjoy a slice. I took my first bite, the flaky crust melting in my mouth. I savored it, but as I did, I started to feel uneasy. It was strange, as if a weight settled in my stomach. I noticed people around me staring. They whispered to one another, glancing in my direction. I brushed it off at first, thinking maybe they were just curious about the newcomer. But then I caught a few words here and there. "She shouldn't be here. They will not let her leave." My heart raced. Was there something about this pie I didn't know? I wiped my mouth, feeling suddenly dizzy. The world around me began to tilt, and I put a hand on the bench to steady myself. I took another bite of the pie, but it tasted different now, sour and long. I swallowed hard, feeling nausea rise in my throat. I looked around again, and the townsfolk were still watching, their expressions serious, their eyes full of something I could not identify. Panic surged through me. I realized they were not just watching. They were waiting. I stood up abruptly, but my legs felt like jelly. I had to get out of there. "Are you okay?" a woman asked, stepping closer, her tone sweet yet insincere. "I need to go," I stammered, trying to push past her. I felt unsteady, the ground shifting beneath me. The woman grabbed my arm, holding me in place. "You shouldn't be in a hurry. Stay with us. The pie is best enjoyed here." Her grip tightened, and I felt my heart pound in my chest. "Let go of me," I shouted, struggling to free myself. But others were closing in, blocking my path. "She needs to stay," another man said, his voice low and firm. "You are part of the community now." The weight in my stomach grew heavier. I felt the pie pushing back, threatening to come up. I managed to break the woman's grip, stumbling back. I glanced at the exit of the market, but a few people stood there, watching, preventing my escape. "Please," I begged, my voice shaking. "I just want to leave." A chuckle rippled through the crowd. "You are not allowed to leave," the tall man from before said, stepping forward. "You ate the pie. You have accepted our welcome." My mind raced. They had poisoned me. I was sick from their food, and they did not intend to let me go. I looked for a way out, desperate. I had to act fast. I spotted a narrow path between two stalls. It was a chance. I bolted toward it, adrenaline surging. They shouted, but I pushed through, my heart pounding in my ears. The path led me away from the market, and I could hear their voices behind me, growing fainter. I did not stop. I ran until I reached my car, fumbling for my keys. I was shaking, my hands clammy. I got in, locked the doors, and turned the key in the ignition. The engine roared to life, and I pulled out of that town faster than I had ever driven in my life. I could not look back. As I drove, my stomach twisted painfully. I knew I had to get away from that place. The pie had been a trap, and I barely escaped their grasp. I drove until the town was just a memory in my rearview mirror, and only then did I allow myself to breathe again. I had learned a hard lesson that day. Not all towns were welcoming, and sometimes kindness masked something much darker. I promised myself I would never return, never let myself be caught off guard again.